Today, in Audiobooks for me, we are going to listen to Tarzan and the Golden Lion by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This book is divided in 3 videos. This is Part 1. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 1. The Golden Lion. Sabor, the lioness, suckled her young. A single, fuzzy ball, spotted like Sheeta, the leopard. She lay in the warm sunshine before the rocky cavern that was her lair, stretched out upon her side with half-closed eyes. Yet Sabor was alert. There had been 3 of these little fuzzy balls at first, 2 daughters and a son, and Sabor and Numa, their sire, had been proud of them, proud and happy. But kills had not been plentiful, and Sabor, undernourished, had been unable to produce sufficient milk to nourish properly 3 lusty cubs, and then a cold rain had come, and the little ones had sickened. Only the strongest survived. The 2 daughters had died. Sabor had mourned, pacing to and fro beside the pitiful bits of bedraggled fur, whining and moaning. Now and again she would nose them with her muzzle, as though she would awaken them from the long sleep that knows no waking. At last, however, she abandoned her efforts, and now her whole savage heart was filled with concern for the little male cub that remained to her. That was why Sabor was more alert than usual. Numa, the lion, was away. 2 nights before, he had made a kill and dragged it to their lair, and last night he had fared forth again, but he had not returned. Sabor was thinking, as she half-dozed, of Wapi, the plump antelope, that her splendid mate might this very minute be dragging through the tangled jungle to her. Or perhaps it would be Paco, the zebra whose flesh was the best beloved of her kind, juicy, succulent Paco. Sabor's mouth watered. Ah, what was that? The shadow of a sound had come to those keen ears. She raised her head, cocking it first upon one side and then the other, as with up-pricked ears she sought to catch the faintest repetition of that which had disturbed her. Her nose sniffed the air. There was but the suggestion of a breeze, but what there was moved toward her from the direction of the sound she had heard, and which she still heard in a slightly increasing volume that told her that whatever was making it was approaching her. As it drew closer, the beast's nervousness increased, and she rolled over on her belly, shutting off the milk supply from the cub, which vented its disapproval in miniature growls until a low, querulous whine from the lioness silenced him. Then he stood at her side, looking first at her, and then in the direction toward which she looked, cocking his little head first on one side and then on the other. Evidently, there was a disturbing quality in the sound that Sabor heard, something that inspired a certain restlessness, if not actual apprehension, though she could not be sure as yet that it boded ill. It might be her great lord returning, but it did not sound like the movement of a lion, certainly not like a lion dragging a heavy kill. She glanced at her cub, breathing, as she did so, a plaintive whine. There was always the fear that some danger menaced him, this last of her little family, but she, Sabor the lioness, was there to defend him. Presently the breeze brought to her nostrils the scent spore of the thing that moved toward her through the jungle. Instantly the troubled mother face was metamorphosed into a bare-fanged, glittering-eyed mask of savage rage, for the scent that had come up to her through the jungle was the hated man scent. She rose to her feet, her head flattened, her sinuous tail twitching nervously. Through that strange medium by which animals communicate with one another, she cautioned her cub to lie down and remain where he was until she returned. Then she moved rapidly and silently to meet the intruder. The cub had heard what its mother heard, and now he caught the smell of man, an unfamiliar smell that had never impinged upon his nostrils before, yet a smell that he knew at once for that of an enemy. a smell that brought a reaction as typical as that which marked the attitude of the grown lioness, bringing the hairs along his little spine, erect and baring his tiny fangs. As the adult moved quickly and stealthily into the underbrush, the small cub, ignoring her injunction, followed after her, his hindquarters wobbling from side to side after the manner of the very young of his kind, the ridiculous gait comporting ill with the dignified bearing of his forequarters. But the lioness, intent upon that which lay before her, did not know that he followed her. There was dense jungle before the two for 100 yards, but through it the lions had worn a tunnel-like path to their lair, and then there was a small clearing through which ran a well-worn jungle trail, out of the jungle at one end of the clearing and into the jungle again at the other. As Sabor reached the clearing, she saw the object of her fear and hatred well within it. What if the man-thing were not hunting her or hers? What if he even dreamed not of their presence? These facts were as nothing to Sabor, the lioness, today. Ordinarily she would have let him pass unmolested, so long as he did not come close enough to threaten the safety of her cub. Or, cubless, she would have slunk away at the first intimation of his approach. But today, the lioness was nervous and fearful. Fearful because of the single cub that remained to her. Her maternal instincts centered threefold, perhaps, upon this lone and triply loved survivor. And so she did not wait for the man to threaten the safety of her little one, but instead, she moved to meet him and to stop him. From the soft mother, she had become a terrifying creature of destruction, her brain obsessed by a single thought: to kill. She did not hesitate an instant at the edge of the clearing, nor did she give the slightest warning. The first intimation that the black warrior had that there was a lion within 20 miles of him was the terrifying apparition of this devil-faced cat charging across the clearing toward him with the speed of an arrow. The black was not searching for lions. Had he known that there was one near, he would have given it a wide berth. He would have fled now had there been anywhere to flee. The nearest tree was farther from him than was the lioness. She could overhaul him before he would have covered a quarter of the distance. There was no hope, and there was only one thing to do. The beast was almost upon him, and behind her he saw a tiny cub. The man bore a heavy spear. He carried it far back with his right hand and hurled it at the very instant that Sabor rose to seize him. The spear passed through the savage heart, and almost simultaneously the giant jaws closed upon the face and skull of the warrior. The momentum of the lioness carried the two heavily to the ground, dead except for a few spasmodic twitchings of their muscles. The orphaned cub stopped 20 feet away and surveyed the first great catastrophe of his life with questioning eyes. He wanted to approach his dam, but a natural fear of the man scent held him away. Presently, he commenced to whine in a tone that always brought his mother to him hurriedly, but this time she did not come. She did not even rise and look toward him. He was puzzled. He could not understand it. He continued to cry, feeling all the while more sad and more lonely. Gradually, he crept closer to his mother. He saw that the strange creature she had killed did not move, and after a while he felt less terror of it, so that at last he found the courage to come quite close to his mother and sniff at her. He still whined to her, but she did not answer. It dawned on him at last that there was something wrong, that his great beautiful mother was not as she had been. A change had come over her. Yet still he clung to her, crying much, until at last he fell asleep, cuddled close to her dead body. It was thus that Tarzan found him. Tarzan and Jane, his wife, and their son, Korak the killer, returning from the mysterious land of Palaldon from which the two men had rescued Jane Clayton. At the sound of their approach, the cub opened his eyes, and rising, flattened his ears and snarled at them, backing close against his dead mother. At sight of him, the ape-man smiled. "Plucky little devil," he commented, taking in the story of the tragedy at a single glance. He approached the spitting cub, expecting it to turn and run away, but it did nothing of the sort. Instead, it snarled more ferociously and struck at his extended hand as he stooped and reached for it. "What a brave little fellow," cried Jane. "Poor little orphan." "He's going to make a great lion, or he would have, if his dam had lived," said Korak. "Look at that back, as straight and strong as a spear. Too bad the rascal has got to die." "He doesn't have to die," returned Tarzan. "There's not much chance for him. He'll need milk for a couple of months more. And who's going to get it for him?" "I am," replied Tarzan. "You're going to adopt him?" Tarzan nodded. Korak and Jane laughed. "That'll be fine," commented the former. "Lord Greystoke, foster mother to the son of Numa," laughed Jane. Tarzan smiled with them, but he did not cease his attentions toward the cub. Reaching out suddenly, he caught the little lion by the scruff of its neck, and then stroking it gently, he talked to it in a low, crooning tone. I do not know what he said, but perhaps the cub did, for presently it ceased its struggles and no longer sought to scratch or bite the caressing hand. After that, he picked it up and held it against his breast. It did not seem afraid now, nor did it even bare its fangs against this close proximity to the erstwhile hated man scent. "How do you do it?" exclaimed Jane Clayton. Tarzan shrugged his broad shoulders. "Your kind are not afraid of you. These are really my kind. Try to civilize me as you will, and perhaps that is why they are not afraid of me when I give them the signs of friendship. Even this little rascal seems to know it, doesn't he?" "I can never understand it," commented Korak. "I think I am rather familiar with African animals, yet I haven't the power over them or the understanding that you have. Why is it?" "There is but one Tarzan," said Lady Greystoke, smiling at her son teasingly, and yet her tone was not without a note of pride. "Remember that I was born among beasts and raised by beasts," Tarzan reminded him. "Perhaps after all my father was an ape. You know Kyla always insisted that he was." "John, how can you?" exclaimed Jane. "You know perfectly well who your father and mother were." Tarzan looked solemnly at his son and closed one eye. "Your mother never can learn to appreciate the fine qualities of the anthropoids. One might almost think that she objected to the suggestion that she had mated with one of them. John Clayton, I shall never speak to you again if you don't stop saying such hideous things. I am ashamed of you. It is bad enough that you are an unregenerate wild man, without trying to suggest that you may be an ape into the bargain." The long journey from Palaldon was almost completed. Inside the week, they should be again at the site of their former home. Whether anything now remained of the ruins the Germans had left was problematical. The barns and outhouses had all been burned, and the interior of the bungalow partially wrecked. Those of the Waziri, the faithful native retainers of the Greystokes, who had not been killed by Hauptmann Fritz Schneider's soldiers, had rallied to the beat of the war drum and gone to place themselves at the disposal of the English in whatever capacity they might be found useful to the great cause of humanity. This much Tarzan had known before he set out in search of Lady Jane, but how many of his warlike Waziri had survived the war and what further had befallen his vast estates he did not know. Wandering tribes of natives or raiding bands of Arab slavers might have completed the demolition inaugurated by the Hun, and it was likely, too, that the jungle had swept up and reclaimed its own, covering his clearings and burying amidst its riot of lush verdure every sign of man's brief trespass upon its world-old preserves. Following the adoption of the tiny Numa, Tarzan was compelled to an immediate consideration of the needs of his protégé in planning his marches and his halts, for the cub must have sustenance, and that sustenance could be naught but milk. Lion's milk was out of the question, but fortunately they were now in a comparatively well-peopled country where villages were not infrequent and where the great lord of the jungle was known, feared, and respected. And so it was that upon the afternoon of the day he had found the young lion, Tarzan approached a village for the purpose of obtaining milk for the cub. At first the natives appeared sullen and indifferent, looking with contempt upon whites who travelled without a large safari, with contempt and without fear. With no safari, these strangers could carry no presents for them, nor anything wherewith to repay for the food they would doubtless desire, and with no askari, they could not demand food, or rather, they could not enforce an order, nor could they protect themselves should it seem worthwhile to molest them. Sullen and indifferent the natives seemed, yet they were scarce unconcerned, their curiosity being aroused by the unusual apparel and ornamentation of these whites. They saw them almost as naked as themselves, and armed similarly, except that one, the younger man, carried a rifle. All three wore the trappings of Pal Uldon, primitive and barbaric, and entirely strange to the eyes of the simple blacks. "Where is your chief?" asked Tarzan, as he strode into the village, amongst the women, the children, and the yapping dogs. A few dozing warriors rose from the shadows of the huts where they had been lying and approached the newcomers. "The chief sleeps," replied one. "Who are you to awaken him? What do you want?" "I wish to speak to your chief. Go and fetch him." The warrior looked at him in wide-eyed amaze and then broke into a loud laugh. "The chief must be brought to him," he cried, addressing his fellows, and then, laughing loudly, he slapped his thigh and nudged those nearest him with his elbows. "Tell him," continued the ape-man, "that Tarzan would speak with him." Instantly the attitude of his auditors underwent a remarkable transformation. They fell back from him and they ceased laughing, their eyes very wide and round. He, who had laughed loudest, became suddenly solemn. "Bring mats," he cried, "for Tarzan and his people to sit upon while I fetch Umanga the chief." And off he ran as fast as he could, as though glad of the excuse to escape the presence of the mighty one he feared he had offended. It made no difference now that they had no safari, no askari, nor any presents. The villagers were vying with one another to do them honor. Even before the chief came, many had already brought presents of food and ornaments. Presently Umanga appeared. He was an old man who had been a chief even before Tarzan of the Apes was born. His manner was patriarchal and dignified, and he greeted his guest as one great man might greet another, yet he was undeniably pleased that the lord of the jungle had honored his village with a visit. When Tarzan explained his wishes and exhibited the lion cub, Umanga assured him that there would be milk aplenty so long as Tarzan honored them with his presence. Warm milk, fresh from the chief's own goats. As they palavered, the ape-man's keen eyes took in every detail of the village and its people, and presently they alighted upon a large bitch among the numerous curs that overran the huts and the street. Her udder was swollen with milk, and the sight of it suggested a plan to Tarzan. He jerked a thumb in the direction of the animal. "I would buy her," he said to Umanga. "She is yours, Bwana, without payment," replied the chief. "She whelped 2 days since, and last night her pups were all stolen from her nest, doubtless by a great snake. But if you will accept them, I will give you instead as many younger and fatter dogs as you wish, for I am sure that this one would prove poor eating." "I do not wish to eat her," replied Tarzan. "I will take her along with me to furnish milk for the cub. Have her brought to me." Some boys then caught the animal and, tying a thong about its neck, dragged it to the ape-man. Like the lion, the dog was at first afraid, for the scent of the Tarmangani was not as the scent of the blacks, and it snarled and snapped at its new master. But at length he won the animal's confidence, so that it lay quietly beside him while he stroked its head. To get the lion close to it was, however, another matter, for here both were terrified by the enemy scent of the other, the lion snarling and spitting, and the dog bare-fanged and growling. It required patience, infinite patience, but at last the thing was an accomplished fact, and the cur-bitch suckled the son of Numa. Hunger had succeeded in overcoming the natural suspicion of the lion, while the firm, yet kindly attitude of the ape-man had won the confidence of the canine, which had been accustomed through life to more of cuffs and kicks than kindness. That night Tarzan had the dog tied in the hut he occupied, and twice before morning he made her lie while the cub fed. The next day they took leave of Umanga and his people, and with the dog still upon a leash, trotting beside them, they set off once more toward home. The young lion cuddled in the hollow of one of Tarzan's arms, or carried in a sack slung across his shoulder. They named the lion Jad-bal-ja, which in the language of the Pithecanthropi of Paluldon means the golden lion, because of his color. Every day he became more accustomed to them and to his foster mother, who finally came to accept him as flesh of her flesh. The bitch they called Za, meaning girl. The second day they removed her leash, and she followed them willingly through the jungle. Nor ever after did she seek to leave them, nor was happy unless she was near one of the three. As the moment approached when the trail should break from the jungle onto the edge of the rolling plain where their home had been, the three were filled with suppressed excitement, though none uttered a syllable of the hope and fear that was in the heart of each. What would they find? What could they find other than the same tangled mass of vegetation that the ape-man had cleared away to build his home, when first he had come there with his bride? At last they stepped from the concealing verdure of the forest to look out across the plain, where in the distance the outlines of the bungalow had once been clearly discernible, nestled amidst the trees and shrubs that had been retained or imported to beautify the grounds. "Look!" cried Lady Jane. "It is there. It is still there." "But what are those other things to the left beyond it?" asked Korak. "They are the huts of natives," replied Tarzan. "The fields are being cultivated," exclaimed the woman. "And some of the outbuildings have been rebuilt," said Tarzan. "It can mean but one thing. The Waziri have come back from the war. My faithful Waziri. They have restored what the Hun destroyed and are watching over our home until we return." He caught the little lion by the scruff of its neck. Chapter 2: The Training of Jad-bal-ja. And so Tarzan of the Apes and Jane Clayton and Korak came home after a long absence, and with them came Jad-bal-ja, the golden lion, and Za, the bitch. Among the first to meet them and to welcome them home was old Muviro, father of Wasimbu, who had given his life in defense of the home and wife of the ape-man. "Ah, Bwana," cried the faithful black, "my old eyes are made young again by the sight of you. It has been long that you have been gone, but though many doubted that you would return, old Muviro knew that the great world held nothing that might overcome his master, and so he knew too that his master would return to the home of his love and the land where his faithful Waziri awaited him, but that she, whom we have mourned as dead, should have returned is beyond belief, and great shall be the rejoicing in the huts of the Waziri tonight, and the earth shall tremble to the dancing feet of the warriors, and the heavens ring with the glad cries of their women, since the three they love most on earth have come back to them. And in truth, great indeed was the rejoicing in the huts of the Waziri, and not for one night alone, but for many nights did the dancing and the rejoicing continue until Tarzan was compelled to put a stop to the festivities that he and his family might gain a few hours of unbroken slumber. The ape-man found that not only had his faithful Waziri, under the equally faithful guidance of his English foreman Jervis, completely rehabilitated his stables, corrals, and outbuildings, as well as the native huts, but had restored the interior of the bungalow, so that in all outward appearances the place was precisely as it had been before the raid of the Germans. Jervis was at Nairobi on the business of the estate, and it was some days after their arrival that he returned to the ranch. His surprise and happiness were no less genuine than those of the Waziri. With the chief and warriors, he sat for hours at the feet of the big bwana, listening to an account of the strange land of Palul Don and the adventures that had befallen the three during Lady Greystoke's captivity there, and with the Waziri, he marveled at the queer pets the ape-man had brought back with him. That Tarzan might have fancied a mongrel native cur was strange enough, but that he should have adopted a cub of his hereditary enemies, Numa and Saba, seemed beyond all belief. And equally surprising to them all was the manner of Tarzan's education of the cub. The golden lion and his foster mother occupied a corner of the ape-man's bedroom, and many was the hour each day that he spent in training and educating the little spotted yellow ball, all playfulness and affection now, but one day to grow into a great savage beast of prey. As the days passed and the golden lion grew, Tarzan taught it many tricks, to fetch and carry, to lie motionless in hiding, at his almost inaudible word of command, to move from point to point as he indicated, to hunt for hidden things by scent, and to retrieve them. And when meat was added to its diet, he fed it always in a way that brought grim smiles to the savage lips of the Waziri warriors, for Tarzan had built for him a dummy in the semblance of a man, and the meat that the lion was to eat was fastened always at the throat of the dummy. Never did the manner of feeding vary. At a word from the ape-man, the golden lion would crouch, belly to the ground, and then Tarzan would point at the dummy and whisper the single word, "Kill." However hungry he might be, the lion learned never to move toward his meat until that single word had been uttered by its master, and then with a rush and a savage growl, it drove straight for the flesh. While it was little, it had difficulty at first in clambering up the dummy to the savory morsel fastened at the figure's throat, but as it grew older and larger, it gained the objective more easily, and finally a single leap would carry it to its goal, and down would go the dummy upon its back, with the young lion tearing at its throat. There was one lesson that of all the others was most difficult to learn, and it is doubtful that any other than Tarzan of the Apes, reared by beasts, among beasts, could have overcome the savage bloodlust of the carnivore and rendered his natural instinct subservient to the will of his master. It took weeks and months of patient endeavor to accomplish this single item of the lion's education, which consisted in teaching him that at the word fetch, he must find any indicated object and return with it to his master, even the dummy with raw meat tied at its throat, and that he must not touch the meat nor harm the dummy nor any other article that he was fetching, but placed them carefully at the ape-man's feet. Afterward, he learned always to be sure of his reward, which usually consisted in a double portion of the meat that he loved best. Lady Greystoke and Korak were often interested spectators of the education of the Golden Lion, though the former expressed mystification as to the purpose of such elaborate training of the young cub, and some misgivings as to the wisdom of the ape-man's program. "What in the world can you do with such a brute after he is grown?" she asked. "He bids fair to be a mighty Numa. Being accustomed to men, he will be utterly fearless of them, and having fed always at the throat of a dummy, he will look there at the throat of living men for his food hereafter." "He will feed only upon what I tell him to feed," replied the ape-man. "But you do not expect him to feed always upon men?" she interrogated laughingly. "He will never feed upon men." "But how can you prevent it, having taught him from cubhood always to feed upon men?" "I am afraid, Jane, that you underestimate the intelligence of a lion, or else I very much overestimate it. If your theory is correct, the hardest part of my work is yet before me, but if I am right, it is practically complete now. However, we will experiment a bit and see which is right. We shall take Jad-bal-ja out upon the plain with us this afternoon. Game is plentiful, and we shall have no difficulty in ascertaining just how much control I have over young Numa after all." "I'll wager £100, said Korak, laughing, "that he does just what he jolly well pleases after he gets a taste of live blood." "You're on, my son," said the ape-man. "I think I am going to show you and your mother this afternoon what you or anyone else never dreamed could be accomplished." "Lord Greystoke, the world's premier animal trainer," cried Lady Greystoke, and Tarzan joined them in their laughter. "It is not animal training," said the ape-man. "The plan upon which I work would be impossible to anyone but Tarzan of the Apes. Let us take a hypothetical case to illustrate what I mean. There comes to you some creature whom you hate, whom by instinct and heredity you consider a deadly enemy. You are afraid of him. You understand no word that he speaks. Finally, by means sometimes brutal, he impresses upon your mind his wishes. You may do the thing he wants, but do you do it with a spirit of unselfish loyalty? You do not. You do it under compulsion, hating the creature that forces his will upon you. At any moment that you felt it was in your power to do so, you would disobey him. You would even go further. You would turn upon him and destroy him. On the other hand, there comes to you one with whom you are familiar. He is a friend, a protector. He understands and speaks the language that you understand and speak. He has fed you. He has gained your confidence. By kindness and protection, he asks you to do something for him. Do you refuse? No, you obey willingly. It is thus that the Golden Lion will obey me." "As long as it suits his purpose to do so," commented Korak. "Let me go a step farther then," said the ape-man. "Suppose that this creature, whom you love and obey, has the power to punish, even to kill you, if it is necessary so to do to enforce his commands. How then about your obedience?" "We'll see," said Korak, "how easily the Golden Lion will make £100 for me." That afternoon, they set out across the plain, Jad-bal-ja following Tarzan's horse's heels. They dismounted at a little clump of trees some distance from the bungalow, and from there proceeded onward warily toward a swale in which antelopes were usually to be found, moving up which they came cautiously to the heavy brush that bordered the swale upon their side. There was Tarzan, Jane, and Korak, and close beside Tarzan the Golden Lion, 4 jungle hunters, and of the 4 Jad-bal-ja the lion was the least accomplished. Stealthily they crawled through the brush, scarce a leaf rustling to their passage, until at last they looked down into the swale upon a small herd of antelope grazing peacefully below. Closest to them was an old buck, and him Tarzan pointed out in some mysterious manner to Jad-bal-ja. "Fetch him," he whispered, and the golden lion rumbled a scarce audible acknowledgement of the command. Stealthily he worked his way through the brush. The antelopes fed on, unsuspecting. The distance separating the lion from his prey was over great for a successful charge, and so Jad-bal-ja waited, hiding in the brush, until the antelope should either graze closer to him or turn its back toward him. No sound came from the fore, watching the grazing herbivora, nor did the latter give any indication of a suspicion of the nearness of danger. The old buck moved slowly closer to Jad-bal-ja. Almost imperceptibly, the lion was gathering for the charge. The only noticeable movement was the twitching of his tail's tip, and then, as lightning from the sky, as an arrow from a bow, he shot from immobility to tremendous speed. In an instant, he was almost upon the buck, before the latter realized the proximity of danger. And then it was too late, for scarcely had the antelope wheeled than the lion rose upon its hind legs and seized it, while the balance of the herd broke into precipitate flight. "Now," said Korak, "we shall see." "He will bring the antelope to me," said Tarzan confidently. The golden lion hesitated a moment, growling over the carcass of his kill. Then he seized it by the back, and with his head turned to one side, dragged it along the ground beside him, as he made his way slowly back toward Tarzan. Through the brush, he dragged the slain antelope until he had dropped it at the feet of his master, where he stood, looking up at the face of the ape-man with an expression that could not have been construed into aught but pride in his achievement and a plea for commendation. Tarzan stroked his head and spoke to him in a low voice, praising him, and then, drawing his hunting knife, he cut the jugular of the antelope and let the blood from the carcass. Jane and Korak stood close, watching Jad-bal-ja. What would the lion do with the smell of fresh, hot blood in his nostrils? He sniffed at it and growled, and with bared fangs he eyed the three wickedly. The ape-man pushed him away with his open palm, and the lion growled again angrily and snapped at him. Quick is Numa, quick is Bara, the deer, but Tarzan of the Apes is lightning. So swiftly did he strike, and so heavily, that Jad-bal-ja was falling on his back almost in the very instant that he had growled at his master. Swiftly he came to his feet again, and the two stood facing one another. "Down," commanded the ape-man. "Lie down, Jad-bal-ja." His voice was low and firm. The lion hesitated, but for an instant, and then lay down, as Tarzan of the Apes had taught him to do at the word of command. Tarzan turned and lifted the carcass of the antelope to his shoulder. "Come," he said to Jad-bal-ja, "heel." And without another glance at the carnivore, he moved off toward the horses. "I might have known it," said Korak with a laugh, "and saved my £100. "Of course you might have known it," said his mother. Chapter 3: A Meeting of Mystery. A rather attractive-looking, though overdressed, young woman was dining in a second-rate chop-house in London. She was noticeable, not so much for her fine figure and coarsely beautiful face, as for the size and appearance of her companion, a large, well-proportioned man in the mid-20s, with such a tremendous beard that it gave him the appearance of hiding in ambush. He stood fully 3 inches over 6 feet. His shoulders were broad, his chest deep, and his hips narrow. His physique, his carriage, everything about him suggested indubitably the trained athlete. The two were in close conversation, a conversation that occasionally gave every evidence of bordering upon heated argument. "I tell you," said the man, "that I do not see what we need of the others. Why should they share with us? Why divide into 6 portions that which you and I might have alone?" "It takes money to carry the plan through," she replied, "and neither you nor I have any money. They have it, and they will back us with it. Me for my knowledge, and you for your appearance and your strength. They searched for you, Esteban, for 2 years, and now that they have found you, I should not care to be in your shoes if you betrayed them. They would just as soon slit your throat as not, Esteban, if they no more than thought they couldn't use you, now that you have all the details of their plan. But if you should try to take all the profit from them—" She paused, shrugging her shoulders. "No, my dear. I love life too well to join you in any such conspiracy as that. But I tell you, Flora, we ought to get more out of it than they want to give. You furnish all the knowledge, and I take all the risk. Why shouldn't we have more than a sixth apiece?" "Talk to them yourself then, Esteban," said the girl with a shrug. "But if you will take my advice, you will be satisfied with what you are offered. Not only have I the information without which they can do nothing, but I found you into the bargain. Yet I do not ask it all. I shall be perfectly satisfied with 1/6, and I can assure you that if you do not muddle the thing, 1/6 of what you bring out will be enough for any one of us for the rest of his natural life." The man did not seem convinced, and the young woman had a feeling that he would bear watching. Really, she knew very little about him, and had seen him in person only a few times since her first discovery of him, some 2 months before, upon the screen of a London cinema house, in a spectacular feature in which he had played the role of a Roman soldier of the Praetorian Guard. Here his heroic size and perfect physique had alone entitled him to consideration, for his part was a minor one, and doubtless of all the thousands who saw him upon the silver sheet, Flora Hawkes was the only one who took more than a passing interest in him, and her interest was aroused not by his histrionic ability, but rather because for some 2 years she and her confederates had been searching for such a type as Esteban Miranda so admirably represented. To find him in the flesh bade fair to prove difficult of accomplishment, but after a month of seemingly fruitless searching, she finally discovered him among a score of extra men at the studio of one of London's lesser producing companies. She needed no other credentials than her good looks to form his acquaintance, and while that was ripening into intimacy, she made no mention to him of the real purpose of her association with him. That he was a Spaniard and apparently of good family was evident to her, and that he was unscrupulous was to be guessed by the celerity with which he agreed to take part in the shady transaction that had been conceived in the mind of Flora Hawkes, and the details of which had been perfected by her and her 4 confederates. So, therefore, knowing that he was unscrupulous, she was aware that every precaution must be taken to prevent him taking advantage of the knowledge of their plan that he must one day have in detail, the key to which she, up to the present moment, had kept entirely to herself, not even confiding it to any one of her 4 other confederates. They sat for a moment in silence, toying with the empty glasses from which they had been drinking. Presently she looked up to find his gaze fixed upon her, and an expression in his eyes that even a less sophisticated woman than Flora Hawkes might readily have interpreted. "You can make me do anything you want, Flora," he said, "for when I am with you, I forget the gold, and think only of that other reward which you continually deny me, but which one day I shall win." "Love and business do not mix well," replied the girl. "Wait until you have succeeded in this work, Esteban, and then we may talk of love." You do not love me, he whispered hoarsely. I know, I have seen, that each of the others loves you. That is why I could hate them. And if I thought that you loved one of them, I could cut his heart out. Sometimes I have thought that you did, first one of them, and then another. You are too familiar with them, Flora. I have seen John Peebles squeeze your hand when he thought no one was looking, and when you dance with Dick Throck, he holds you too close, and you dance cheek to cheek. I tell you, I do not like it, Flora, and one of these days I shall forget all about the gold and think only of you, and then something will happen, and there will not be so many to divide the ingots that I shall bring back from Africa. And Bloober and Krasky are almost as bad. Perhaps Krasky is the worst of all, for he is a good-looking devil, and I do not like the way in which you cast sheep's eyes at him. The fire of growing anger was leaping to the girl's eyes. With an angry gesture, she silenced him. What business is it of yours, Signor Miranda, who I choose for my friends, or how I treat them, or how they treat me? I will have you understand that I have known these men for years, while I have known you for but a few weeks, and if any has a right to dictate my behavior, which thank God none has, it would be one of them rather than you. His eyes blazed angrily. It is as I thought, he cried. You love one of them. He half rose from the table and leaned across it toward her, menacingly. Just let me find out which one it is, and I will cut him into pieces. He ran his fingers through his long, black hair until it stood up on end, like the mane of an angry lion. His eyes were blazing with a light that sent a chill of dread through the girl's heart. He appeared a man temporarily bereft of reason. If he were not a maniac, he most certainly looked one, and the girl was afraid, and realized that she must placate him. Come, come, Esteban, she whispered softly. There is no need for working yourself into a towering rage over nothing. I have not said that I loved one of these, nor have I said that I do not love you, but I am not used to being wooed in such fashion. Perhaps your Spanish senoritas like it, but I am an English girl, and if you love me, treat me as an English lover would treat me. You have not said that you loved one of these others, no, but on the other hand, you have not said that you do not love one of them. Tell me, Flora, which one of them is it that you love? His eyes were still blazing, and his great frame trembling with suppressed passion. I do not love any of them, Esteban, she replied, nor as yet do I love you. But I could, Esteban, that much I will tell you. I could love you, Esteban, as I could never love another, but I shall not permit myself to do so until after you have returned, and we are free to live where and how we like. Then maybe, but even so, I do not promise. You had better promise, he said sullenly, though evidently somewhat mollified. You had better promise, Flora, for I care nothing for the gold, if I may not have you also. Hush, she cautioned. Here they come now, and it is about time. They are fully a half-hour late. The man turned his eyes in the direction of her gaze, and the two sat watching the approach of 4 men who had just entered the chop-house. 2 of them were evidently Englishmen, big meaty fellows of the middle class, who looked what they really were, former pugilists. The third, Adolf Bloober, was a short, fat German with a round, red face and a bull neck. The other, the youngest of the 4, was by far the best-looking. His smooth face, clear complexion, and large dark eyes might of themselves have proven sufficient grounds for Miranda's jealousy, but supplementing these were a mop of wavy brown hair, the figure of a Greek god, and the grace of a Russian dancer, which, in truth, was what Karl Krasky was when he chose to be other than a rogue. The girl greeted the 4 pleasantly, while the Spaniard vouchsafed them but a single, surly nod as they found chairs and seated themselves at the table. "Hail!" cried Peebles, pounding the table to attract the attention of a waiter. "Let us have hail." The suggestion met with unanimous approval, and as they waited for their drink, they spoke casually of unimportant things: the heat, the circumstance that had delayed them, the trivial occurrences since they had last met, throughout which Esteban sat in sullen silence. But after the waiter had returned and they drank to Flora, with which ceremony it had long been their custom to signalize each gathering, they got down to business. "Now," cried Peebles, pounding the table with his meaty fist, "here we are, and that's that. We have everything, Flora. The plans, the money, Signor Miranda, and are jolly well ready, old dear, for your part of it." "How much money have you?" asked Flora. "It is going to take a lot of money, and there is no use starting unless you have plenty to carry on with." Peebles turned to Bloober. "There," he said, pointing a pudgy finger at him, "is the bloomin' treasurer. He can tell you how much we have, the fat rascal of a Dutchman." Bloober smiled an oily smile and rubbed his fat palms together. "Well," he said, "how much you think, Miss Flora, we should have?" "Not less than £2,000 to be on the safe side," she replied quickly. "Oi, oi," exclaimed Bloober, "but dot is a lot of money, £2,000. Oi, oi." The girl made a gesture of disgust. "I told you in the first place that I wouldn't have anything to do with a bunch of cheap screws, and that until you had enough money to carry the thing out properly, I would not give you the maps and directions, without which you cannot hope to reach the vaults, where there is stored enough gold to buy this whole, tight, little island, if half that what I have heard them say about it is true. You can go along and spend your own money, but you've got to show me that you have at least £2,000 to spend before I give up the information that will make you the richest men in the world." "The blighter's got the money," growled Throck. "Blimey, if I know what he's beefing about." "He can't help it," growled the Russian. "It's a racial characteristic. Bloober would try to Jew down the marriage license clerk if he were going to get married." "Oh, well," sighed Bloober, "for why should we spend more money than is necessary? If we can do it for £1,000 so much the better." "Certainly," snapped the girl, "and if it don't take but 1,000, that is all that you will have to spend. But you've got to have the 2,000 in case of emergencies, and from what I have seen of that country, you are likely to run up against more emergencies than anything else." "Oi, oi!" cried Bloober. "He's got the money all right," said Peebles. "Now let's get busy." "He may have it, but I want to see it first," replied the girl. "That you think? I carry all dot money around in my pocket?" cried Bloober. "Can't you take our word for it?" grumbled Throck. "You're a nice bunch of crooks to ask me that," she replied, laughing in the face of the burly ruffians. "I'll take Carl's word for it, though, if he tells me that you have it, and that it is in such shape that it can and will be used to pay all the necessary expenses of our expedition. I will believe him." Peebles and Throck scowled angrily, and Miranda's eyes closed to two narrow, nasty slits as he directed his gaze upon the Russian. Bloober, on the contrary, was affected not at all. The more he was insulted, the better. Apparently, he liked it. Toward one who treated him with consideration or respect, he would have become arrogant while he fawned upon the hand that struck him. Krasky, alone, smiled a self-satisfied smile that set the blood of the Spaniard boiling. "Bloober has the money, Flora," he said. "Each of us has contributed his share. We'll make Bloober treasurer because we know that he will squeeze the last farthing until it shrieks before he will let it escape him. It is our plan now to set out from London in pairs." He drew a map from his pocket and, unfolding it, spread it out upon the table before them. With his finger, he indicated a point marked X. Here we will meet, and here we will equip our expedition. Bloober and Miranda will go first, then Peebles and Throck. By the time that you and I arrive, everything will be in shape for moving immediately into the interior, where we shall establish a permanent camp, off the beaten track and as near our objective as possible. Miranda will disport himself behind his whiskers until he is ready to set out upon the final stage of his long journey. I understand that he is well schooled in the part that he is to play, and that he can depict the character to perfection. As he will have only ignorant natives and wild beasts to deceive, it should not tax his histrionic ability too greatly. There was a veiled note of sarcasm in the soft, drawling tone that caused the black eyes of the Spaniard to gleam wickedly. "Do I understand," asked Miranda, his soft tone belying his angry scowl, "that you and Miss Hawkes travel alone to X?" "You do, unless your understanding is poor," replied the Russian. The Spaniard half rose from the table and leaned across it menacingly toward Krasky. The girl, who was sitting next to him, seized his coat. "None of that," she said, dragging him back into his chair. "There has been too much of it among you already, and if there is any more, I shall cut you all and seek more congenial companions for my expedition." "Yes, cut it out. Here we are, and that's that," exclaimed Peebles belligerently. "John's right," rumbled Throck in his deep bass, "and I'm here to back him up. Flora's right, and I'm here to back her up. And if there is any more of it, blime if I don't bash a couple of you pretty uns." And he looked first at Miranda and then at Krasky. "Now," soothed Bloober, "let's all shake hands and be good friends." "Righto," cried Peebles. "That's the talk. Give him your, and Esteban. Come, Carl, bury the hatchet. We can't start in on this thing with no animosities, and here we are, and that's that." The Russian, feeling secure in his position with Flora, and therefore in a magnanimous mood, extended his hand across the table toward the Spaniard. For a moment, Esteban hesitated. "Come, man, shake," growled Throck, "or you can go back to your job as an extra man, blime, and we'll find someone else to do your work and divvy the swag with." Suddenly, the dark countenance of the Spaniard was lighted by a pleasant smile. He extended his hand quickly and clasped Krasky's. "Forgive me," he said. "I am hot-tempered, but I mean nothing. Miss Hawkes is right. We must all be friends, and here's my hand on it, Krasky, as far as I am concerned." "Good," said Krasky, "and I am sorry if I offended you." But he forgot that the other was an actor, and if he could have seen into the depths of that dark soul, he would have shuddered. "Now, we are all good friends," said Bloober, rubbing his hands together unctuously. "Why not arrange for when we shall commence starting to finish up everythings? Miss Flora, she gives me the map under directions, and we start commencing immediately." "Loan me a pencil, Carl," said the girl, and when the man had handed her one, she searched out a spot upon the map some distance into the interior from X, where she drew a tiny circle. "This is O," she said. "When we all reach here, you shall have the final directions, and not before." Bloober threw up his hands. "Oi, Miss Flora, what you think? We spend £2,000 to buy a pig in a poke. Oi, oi, you wouldn't ask us to do dot? We must see everything. We must know everything before we spend one farthing." "Yes, and here we are, and that's that," roared John Peebles, striking the table with his fist. The girl rose leisurely from her seat. "Oh, very well," she said with a shrug. "If you feel that way about it, we might as well call it all off." "Oh, vite, Miss Flora," cried Bloober, rising hurriedly. "Don't be og-cited, but can't you see where we are? £2,000 is a lot of money, and we are good businessmen. We shouldn't be spending it all without getting nothings for it. I am not asking you to spend it and get nothing for it, replied the girl, tartly. But if anyone has got to trust anyone else in this outfit, it is you who are going to trust me. If I give you all the information I have, there is nothing in the world that could prevent you from going ahead and leaving me out in the cold, and I don't intend that shall happen. But we are not gone-offs, Miss Flora, insisted the Jew. We would not think for 1 minute of cheating you. You're not angels either, Bloober, any of you, retorted the girl. If you want to go ahead with this, you've got to do it in my way, and I am going to be there at the finish to see that I get what is coming to me. You've taken my word for it, up to the present time, that I had the dope, and now you've got to take it the rest of the way, or all bets are off. What good would it do me to go over into a bally jungle and suffer all the hardships that we are bound to suffer, dragging you along with me, if I were not going to be able to deliver the goods when I got there? And I am not such a softy as to think I could get away with it with a bunch of bandits like you if I tried to put anything of that kind over on you. And as long as I do play straight, I feel perfectly safe, for I know that either Esteban or Carl will look after me, and I don't know but what the rest of you would too. Is it a go, or isn't it? Well, John, what do you and Dick think? Asked Bloober, addressing the 2 ex-prize fighters. Carl, I know he will think whatever Flora thinks. Hey? That? Blime, said Throck. I never was much of a hand at trusting nobody unless I had to, but it looks now as though we had to trust Flora. Same here, said John Peebles. If you try any funny work, Flora— He made a significant movement with his finger across his throat. I understand, John, said the girl with a smile, and I know that you would do it as quickly for £2 as you would for 2,000. But you are all agreed, then, to carry on according to my plans. You too, Carl. The Russian nodded. Whatever the rest say goes with me, he remarked. And so the gentle little coterie discussed their plans in so far as they could, each minutest detail that would be necessary to place them all at the O which the girl had drawn upon the map. Chapter 4. What the Footprints Told. When Jad-bal-ja, the golden lion, was 2 years old, he was as magnificent a specimen of his kind as the Greystokes had ever looked upon. In size, he was far above the average of that attained by mature males. In conformation, he was superb, his noble head and his great black mane giving him the appearance of a full-grown male, while in intelligence he far outranked his savage brothers of the forest. Jad-bal-ja was a never-ending source of pride and delight to the ape-man, who had trained him so carefully and nourished him cunningly for the purpose of developing to the full all the latent powers within him. The lion no longer slept at the foot of his master's bed, but occupied a strong cage that Tarzan had constructed for him at the rear of the bungalow. For who knew better than the ape-man that a lion, wherever he may be or however he may have been raised, is yet a lion, a savage flesh-eater. For the first year, he had roamed at will about the house and grounds. After that, he went abroad only in the company of Tarzan. Often the two roamed the plain and the jungle hunting together. In a way, the lion was almost equally as familiar with Jane and Korak, and neither of them feared or mistrusted him. But toward Tarzan of the Apes did he show the greatest affection. The blacks of Tarzan's household he tolerated, nor did he ever offer to molest any of the domestic animals or fowl. After Tarzan had impressed upon him in his early cubhood that appropriate punishment, followed immediately upon any predatory excursion into the corrals or henhouses. The fact that he was never permitted to become ravenously hungry was doubtless the deciding factor in safeguarding the livestock of the farm. The man and the beast seemed to understand one another perfectly. It is doubtful that the lion understood all that Tarzan said to him, but be that as it may, the ease with which he communicated his wishes to the lion bordered upon the uncanny. The obedience that a combination of sternness and affection had elicited from the cub had become largely habit in the grown lion. At Tarzan's command, he would go to great distances and bring back antelope or zebra, laying his kill at his master's feet without offering to taste the flesh himself. And he had even retrieved living animals without harming them. Such, then, was the golden lion that roamed the primeval forest with his godlike master. It was at about this time that there commenced to drift in to the ape-man rumors of a predatory band to the west and south of his estate. Ugly stories of ivory raiding, slave running, and torture, such as had not disturbed the quiet of the ape-man's savage jungle since the days of Sheikh Amor ben Khatur. And there came other tales, too, that caused Tarzan of the Apes to pucker his brows in puzzlement and thought, and then a month elapsed during which Tarzan heard no more of the rumors from the west. The war had reduced the resources of the Greystokes to but a meager income. They had given practically all to the cause of the Allies, and now what little had remained to them had been all but exhausted in the rehabilitation of Tarzan's African estate. "It looks very much, Jane," he said to his wife one night, "as though another trip to Opar were on the books." "I dread to think of it. I do not want you to go," she said. "You have come away from that awful city twice, but barely with your life. The third time, you may not be so fortunate. We have enough, John, to permit us to live here in comfort and in happiness. Why jeopardize those two things which are greater than all wealth in another attempt to raid the treasure vaults?" "There is no danger, Jane," he assured her. "The last time Werper dogged my footsteps, and between him and the earthquake, I was nearly done for. But there is no chance of any such combination of circumstances thwarting me again." "You will not go alone, John?" she asked. "You will take Korak with you?" "No," he said. "I shall not take him. He must remain here with you. For really, my long absences are more dangerous to you than to me. I shall take 50 of the Waziri as porters to carry the gold, and thus we should be able to bring out enough to last us for a long time." "And Jad-bal-ja," she asked, "shall you take him?" "No, he had better remain here. Korak can look after him and take him out for a hunt occasionally. I'm going to travel light and fast, and it would be too hard a trip for him. Lions don't care to move around much in the hot sun, and as we shall travel mostly by day, I doubt if Jad-bal-ja would last long." And so it befell that Tarzan of the Apes set out once more upon the long trail that leads to Opar. Behind him marched 50 giant Waziri, the pick of the warlike tribe that had adopted Tarzan as its chief. Upon the veranda of the bungalow stood Jane and Korak, waving their adieu, while from the rear of the building there came to the ape-man's ears the rumbling roar of Jad-bal-ja, the golden lion. And as they marched away, the voice of Numa accompanied them out upon the rolling plain, until at last it trailed off to nothingness in the distance. His speed determined by that of the slowest of the blacks, Tarzan made but comparatively rapid progress. Opar lay a good 25 days' trek from the farm for men traveling light, as were these, but upon the return journey, laden as they would be with the ingots of gold, their progress would be slower. And because of this, the ape-man had allotted 2 months for the venture. His safari, consisting of seasoned warriors only, permitted of really rapid progress. They carried no supplies, for they were all hunters and were moving through a country in which game was abundant. No need, then, for burdening themselves with the cumbersome impedimenta of white huntsmen. A thorn boma and a few leaves furnished their shelter for the night, while spears and arrows and the powers of their great white chief ensured that their bellies would never go empty. With the picked men that he had brought with him, Tarzan expected to make the trip to Opar in 21 days, though had he been traveling alone, he would have moved 2 or 3 times as fast, since, when Tarzan elected to travel with speed, he fairly flew through the jungle, equally at home in it by day or by night, and practically tireless. It was a mid-afternoon the 3rd week of the march that Tarzan, ranging far ahead of his blacks in search of game, came suddenly upon the carcass of Bara, the deer, a feathered arrow protruding from its flank. It was evident that Bara had been wounded at some little distance from where it had lain down to die, for the location of the missile indicated that the wound could not have caused immediate death. But what particularly caught the attention of the ape-man, even before he had come close enough to make a minute examination, was the design of the arrow, and immediately he withdrew it from the body of the deer. He knew it for what it was, and was filled with such wonderment as might come to you or to me were we to see a native Swazi headdress upon Broadway or the Strand, for the arrow was precisely such as one may purchase in most any sporting goods house in any large city of the world, such an arrow as is sold and used for archery practice in the parks and suburbs. Nothing could have been more incongruous than this silly toy in the heart of savage Africa, and yet that it had done its work effectively was evident by the dead body of Bara, though the ape-man guessed that the shaft had been sped by no practiced savage hand. Tarzan's curiosity was aroused, and also his inherent jungle caution. One must know his jungle well to survive long the jungle, and if one would know it well, he must let no unusual occurrence or circumstance go unexplained. And so it was that Tarzan set out upon the back track of Bara for the purpose of ascertaining, if possible, the nature of Bara's slayer. The bloody spoor was easily followed, and the ape-man wondered why it was that the hunter had not tracked and overtaken his quarry, which had evidently been dead since the previous day. He found that Bara had traveled far, and the sun was already low in the west before Tarzan came upon the first indications of the slayer of the animal. These were in the nature of footprints that filled him with quite as much surprise as had the arrow. He examined them carefully, and stooping low, even sniffed at them with his sensitive nostrils. Improbable, nay impossible though it seemed, the naked footprints were those of a white man, a large man, probably as large as Tarzan himself. As the foster son of Kala stood gazing upon the spoor of the mysterious stranger, he ran the fingers of one hand through his thick, black hair in a characteristic gesture, indicative of deep puzzlement. What naked white man could there be in Tarzan's jungle who slew Tarzan's game with the pretty arrow of an archery club? It was incredible that there should be such a one, and yet there recurred to the ape-man's mind the vague rumors that he had heard weeks before. Determined to solve the mystery, he set out now upon the trail of the stranger, an erratic trail which wound about through the jungle, apparently aimlessly, prompted Tarzan guessed by the ignorance of an inexperienced hunter. But night fell before he had arrived at a solution of the riddle, and it was pitch dark as the ape-man turned his steps toward camp. He knew that his Waziri would be expecting meat, and it was not Tarzan's intention to disappoint them, though he then discovered that he was not the only carnivore hunting the district that night. The coughing grunt of a lion close by apprised him of it first, and then, from the distance, the deep roar of another. But of what moment was it to the ape-man that others hunted? It would not be the first time that he had pitted his cunning, his strength, and his agility against the other hunters of his savage world, both man and beast. And so it was that Tarzan made his kill at last, snatching it almost from under the nose of a disappointed and infuriated lion, a fat antelope that the latter had marked as his own. Throwing his kill to his shoulder, almost in the path of the charging Numa, the ape-man swung lightly to the lower terraces, and with a taunting laugh for the infuriated cat, vanished noiselessly into the night. He found the camp and his hungry Waziri without trouble, and so great was their faith in him that they not for a moment doubted but that he would return with meat for them. Early the following morning, Tarzan set out again toward Opar, and directing his Waziri to continue the march in the most direct way, he left them that he might pursue further his investigations of the mysterious presence in his jungle that the arrow and the footsteps had apprised him of. Coming again to the spot at which darkness had forced him to abandon his investigations, he took up the spoor of the stranger. Nor had he followed it far before he came upon further evidence of the presence of this new and malign personality. Stretched before him in the trail was the body of a giant ape, one of the tribe of great anthropoids among whom Tarzan had been raised. Protruding from the hairy abdomen of the Mangani was another of the machine-made arrows of civilization. The ape-man's eyes narrowed and a scowl darkened his brow. Who was this who dared invade his sacred preserves and slaughter thus ruthlessly Tarzan's people? A low growl rumbled in the throat of the ape-man. Sloughed with the habiliments of civilization was the thin veneer of civilization that Tarzan wore among white men. No English lord was this who looked upon the corpse of his hairy cousin, but another jungle beast in whose breast raged the unquenchable fire of suspicion and hatred for the man-thing that is the heritage of the jungle bred. A beast of prey viewed the bloody work of ruthless man. Nor was there in the consciousness of Tarzan any acknowledgement of his blood relationship to the killer. Realizing that the trail had been made upon the second day before, Tarzan hastened on in pursuit of the slayer. There was no doubt in his mind but that plain murder had been committed, for he was sufficiently familiar with the traits of the Mangani to know that none of them would provoke assault unless driven to it. Tarzan was traveling upwind, and some half-hour after he had discovered the body of the ape, his keen nostrils caught the scent spoor of others of its kind. Knowing the timidity of these fierce denizens of the jungle, he moved forward now with great wariness, lest, warned of his approach, they take flight before they were aware of his identity. He did not see them often, yet he knew that there were always those among them who recalled him, and that through these he could always establish amicable relations with the balance of the tribe. Owing to the denseness of the undergrowth, Tarzan chose the middle terraces for his advance, and here, swinging freely and swiftly among the leafy boughs, he came presently upon the giant anthropoids. There were about 20 of them in the band, and they were engaged in a little natural clearing in their never-ending search for caterpillars and beetles, which formed important items in the diet of the Mangani. A faint smile overspread the ape-man's face as he paused upon a great branch, himself hidden by the leafy foliage about him, and watched the little band below him. Every action, every movement of the great apes recalled vividly to Tarzan's mind the long years of his childhood, when, protected by the fierce mother-love of Kayla, the she-ape, he had ranged the jungle with the tribe of Kerchak. In the romping young, he saw again Nita and his other childhood playmates, and in the adults, all the great savage brutes he had feared in youth and conquered in manhood. The ways of man may change, but the ways of the ape are the same, yesterday, today, and forever. He watched them in silence for some minutes. How glad they would be to see him when they discovered his identity. For Tarzan of the Apes was known the length and the breadth of the great jungle as the friend and protector of the Mangani. At first, they would growl at him and threaten him, for they would not depend solely on either their eyes or their ears for confirmation of his identity. Not until he had entered the clearing, and bristling bulls with bared fighting fangs had circled him stiffly until they had come close enough for their nostrils to verify the evidence of their eyes and ears, would they finally accept him. Then doubtless there would be great excitement for a few minutes, until, following the instincts of the ape mind, their attention was weaned from him by a blowing leaf, a caterpillar, or a bird's egg, and then they would move about their business, taking no further notice of him more than of any other member of the tribe. But this would not come until after each individual had smelled of him, and perhaps pawed his flesh with calloused hands. Now it was that Tarzan made a friendly sound of greeting, and as the apes looked up, stepped from his concealment into plain view of them. "I am Tarzan of the Apes," he said, "mighty fighter, friend of the Mangani. Tarzan comes in friendship to his people." And with these words, he dropped lightly to the lush grass of the clearing. Instantly, pandemonium reigned. Screaming warnings, the shes raced with the young for the opposite side of the clearing, while the bulls, bristling and growling, faced the intruder. "Come," cried Tarzan, "do you not know me? I am Tarzan of the Apes, friend of the Mangani, son of Kala, and king of the tribe of Kerchak." "We know you," growled one of the old bulls. "Yesterday we saw you when you killed Gobu. Go away, or we shall kill you." "I did not kill Gobu," replied the ape-man. "I found his dead body yesterday, and I was following the spoor of his slayer when I came upon you." "We saw you," repeated the old bull. "Go away, or we shall kill you. You are no longer the friend of the Mangani." The ape-man stood, with brows contracted in thought. It was evident that these apes really believed that they had seen him kill their fellow. What was the explanation? How could it be accounted for? Did the naked footprints of the great white man, whom he had been following, mean more then than he had guessed? Tarzan wondered. He raised his eyes and again addressed the bulls. "It was not I who killed Gobu," he insisted. "Many of you have known me all your lives. You know that only in fair fight, as one bull fights another, have I ever killed a Mangani. You know that, of all the jungle people, the Mangani are my best friends, and that Tarzan of the Apes is the best friend the Mangani have. How, then, could I slay one of my own people?" "We only know," replied the old bull, "that we saw you kill Gobu. With our own eyes, we saw you kill him. Go away quickly, therefore, or we shall kill you. Mighty fighter is Tarzan of the Apes, but mightier even than he are all the great bulls of Pakth. I am Pakth, king of the tribe of Pakth. Go away, before we kill you." Tarzan tried to reason with them, but they would not listen. So confident were they that it was he who had slain their fellow, the bull Gobu. Finally, rather than chance a quarrel in which some of them must inevitably be killed, he turned sorrowfully away. But more than ever now was he determined to seek out the slayer of Gobu, that he might demand an accounting of one who dared thus invade his lifelong domain. Tarzan trailed the spoor until it mingled with the tracks of many men, barefooted blacks mostly, but among them the footprints of booted white men, and once he saw the footprints of a woman or a child, which he could not tell. The trail led apparently toward the rocky hills which protected the barren valley of Opar. Forgetful now of his original mission and imbued only with a savage desire to wrest from the interlopers a full accounting for their presence in the jungle and to mete out to the slayer of Gobu his just deserts, Tarzan forged ahead upon the now broad and well-marked trail of the considerable party, which could not now be much more than a half-day's march ahead of him, which meant that they were doubtless now already upon the rim of the valley of Opar, if this was their ultimate destination. And what other they could have in view, Tarzan could not imagine. He had always kept closely to himself the location of Opar, insofar as he knew no white person, other than Jane and their son Korak, knew of the location of the forgotten city of the ancient Atlanteans. Yet what else could have drawn these white men, with so large a party, into the savage, unexplored wilderness which hemmed Opar upon all sides? Such were the thoughts that occupied Tarzan's mind as he followed swiftly the trail that led toward Opar. Darkness fell, but so fresh was the spoor that the ape-man could follow it by scent, even when he could not see the imprints upon the ground. And presently, in the distance, he saw the light of a camp ahead of him. Before him was the body of a giant anthropoid. Chapter 5. The Fatal Drops. At home, the life in the bungalow and at the farm followed its usual routine, as it had before the departure of Tarzan. Korak, sometimes on foot and sometimes on horseback, followed the activities of the farmhands and the herders, sometimes alone, but more often in company with the white foreman, Jervis, and often, especially when they rode, Jane accompanied them. The golden lion Korak exercised upon a leash, since he was not at all confident of his powers of control over the beast, and feared lest, in the absence of his master, Jad-bal-ja might take to the forest and revert to his natural savage state. Such a lion, abroad in the jungle, would be a distinct menace to human life, for Jad-bal-ja, reared among men, lacked that natural timidity of men that is so marked a trait of all wild beasts. Trained as he had been to make his kill at the throat of a human effigy, it required no considerable powers of imagination upon the part of Korak to visualize what might occur should the golden lion, loosed from all restraint, be thrown upon his own resources in the surrounding jungle. It was during the first week of Tarzan's absence that a runner from Nairobi brought a cable message to Lady Greystoke, announcing the serious illness of her father in London. Mother and son discussed the situation. It would be 5 or 6 weeks before Tarzan could return, even if they sent a runner after him, and were Jane to await him, there would be little likelihood of her reaching her father in time. Even should she depart at once, there seemed only a faint hope that she would arrive early enough to see him alive. It was decided, therefore, that she should set out immediately, Korak accompanying her as far as Nairobi, and then returning to the ranch and resuming its general supervision until his father's return. It is a long trek from the Greystoke estate to Nairobi, and Korak had not yet returned when, about 3 weeks after Tarzan's departure, a black, whose duty it was to feed and care for Jad-bal-ja, carelessly left the door of the cage unfastened while he was cleaning it. The golden lion paced back and forth, while the black wielded his broom within the cage. They were old friends, and the Waziri felt no fear of the great lion, with the result that his back was as often turned to him as not. The black was working in the far corner of the cage, when Jad-bal-ja paused a moment at the door at the opposite end. The beast saw that the gate hung slightly ajar upon its hinges. Silently, he raised a great padded paw and inserted it in the opening. A slight pull, and the gate swung in. Instantly, the golden lion inserted his snout in the widened aperture, and as he swung the barrier aside, the horrified black looked up, to see his charge drop softly to the ground outside. "Stop, Jad-bal-ja! Stop!" screamed the frightened black, leaping after him. But the golden lion only increased his pace, and leaping the fence, loped off in the direction of the forest. The black pursued him with brandishing broom, emitting loud yells that brought the inmates of the Waziri huts into the open, where they joined their fellow in pursuit of the lion. Across the rolling plains, they followed him, but as well have sought to snare the elusive will-o'-the-wisp as this swift and wary fugitive, who heeded neither their blandishments nor their threats. And so it was that they saw the golden lion disappear into the primeval forest. And, though they searched diligently until almost dark, they were forced at length to give up their quest and return crestfallen to the farm. "Ah!" cried the unhappy black who had been responsible for the escape of Jad-bal-ja. "What will the big bwana say to me? What will he do to me when he finds that I have permitted the golden lion to get away?" "You will be banished from the bungalow for a long time, Kiwazi," old Muviro assured him, "and doubtless you will be sent to the grazing ground far to the east to guard the herd there, where you will have plenty of lions for company, though they will not be as friendly as was Jad-bal-ja. It is not half what you deserve, and were the heart of the big bwana not filled with love for his black children, were he like other white bwanas old Muviro has seen, you would be lashed until you could not stand, perhaps until you died." "I am a man," replied Kiwazi. "I am a warrior and a waziri. Whatever punishment the big bwana inflicts, I will accept as a man should." It was that same night that Tarzan approached the campfires of the strange party he had been tracking. Unseen by them, he halted in the foliage of a tree directly in the center of their camp, which was surrounded by an enormous thorn boma and brilliantly lighted by numerous fires which blacks were diligently feeding with branches from an enormous pile of firewood that they had evidently gathered earlier in the day for this purpose. Near the center of the camp were several tents, and before one, in the light of a fire, sat 4 white men. 2 of them were great, bull-necked, red-faced fellows, apparently Englishmen of the lower class. The third appeared to be a short, fat German Jew, while the fourth was a tall, slender, handsome fellow with dark, wavy brown hair and regular features. He and the German were most meticulously garbed for Central African traveling, after the highly idealized standard of motion pictures. In fact, either one of them might have stepped directly from a screening of the latest jungle thriller. The young man was evidently not of English descent, and Tarzan mentally catalogued him almost immediately as a Slav. Shortly after Tarzan's arrival, this one arose and entered one of the nearby tents, from which Tarzan immediately heard the sound of voices in low conversation. He could not distinguish the words, but the tones of one seemed quite distinctly feminine. The 3 remaining at the fire were carrying on a desultory conversation, when suddenly, from near at hand, beyond the boma wall, a lion's roar broke the silence of the jungle. With a startled shriek, the Jew leaped to his feet, so suddenly that he cleared the ground a good foot, and then, stepping backward, he lost his balance, tripped over his camp stool, and sprawled upon his back. "My God, Adolf!" roared one of his companions. "If you do that again, damn me if I don't break your neck. 'Ere we are, and that's that." "Blime if he ain't worse'n a bloomin' lion," growled the other. The Jew crawled to his feet. "Mein Gott," he cried, his voice quavering, "I thought sure he was coming over the fence. S'elp me if I ever get out of dis. Never again. Not for all the gold in Africa would I go truff that. I have been truff diese past 3 months. Oi, oi, when I think of it, oi. Oi, lions und leopards und rhinoceroses und hippopotamuses, oi, oi. His companions laughed. Dick and I tells you right along from the beginning that you hadn't oughter come into the interior, said one of them. But for why I buy all these clothes, wailed the German. Mein Gott, this suit. It stands me 20 guineas, what I stand in. Ach, had I know something, 1 guinea would have bought me my whole wardrobe. 20 guineas for this, and no one to see it, but niggers and lions. And you look like L in it besides, commented one of his friends. And look at it, it's all dirty and torn. How should I know it, I spoiled this suit? Mit mine own eyes I see it at the Princess Tita. How the hero spend 3 months in Africa hunting lions and killing cannibals, and when he comes wid, he hasn't even got a grease spot on his pants. How should I know it? Africa was so dirty and full of thorns. It was at this point that Tarzan of the Apes elected to drop quietly into the circle of firelight before them. The two Englishmen leaped to their feet, quite evidently startled, and the Jew turned and took a half step as though in flight. But immediately his eyes rested upon the ape-man he halted, a look of relief supplanting that of terror which had overspread his countenance, as Tarzan had dropped upon them, apparently, from the heavens. Mein Gott, Esteban, shrilled the German, why you come back so soon, and for why you come back like dot sudden? Don't you suppose we got nerves? Tarzan was angry at these raw intruders, who dared enter without his permission the wide domain in which he kept peace and order. When Tarzan was angry, there flamed upon his forehead the scar that Bolgani, the gorilla, had placed there upon that long-gone day when the boy Tarzan had met the great beast in mortal combat, and first learned the true value of his father's hunting knife. The knife that had placed him, the comparatively weak little Tarmangani, upon an even footing with the great beasts of the jungle. His grey eyes were narrowed, his voice came cold and level as he addressed them. Who are you, he demanded. Who dare thus invade the country of the Waziri, the land of Tarzan, without permission from the Lord of the Jungle? Where do you get that stuff, Esteban? Demanded one of the Englishmen. And what in hell are you doing back here alone and so soon? Where are your porters? Where is the bloomin' gold? The ape-man eyed the speaker in silence for a moment. I am Tarzan of the Apes, he said. I do not know what you are talking about. I only know that I come in search of him who slew Gobu, the great ape, him who slew Bara, the deer, without my permission. Oh, L! Exploded the other Englishman. Stow the guff, Esteban. If you're trying for to be funny, we don't see the joke. Here we are, and that's that. Inside the tent, which the fourth white man had entered while Tarzan was watching the camp from his hiding place in the tree above, a woman, evidently suddenly stirred by terror, touched the arm of her companion frantically and pointed toward the tall, almost naked figure of the ape-man as he stood revealed in the full light of the beast fires. God, Carl, she whispered, in trembling tones. Look. What's wrong, Flora? Inquired her companion. I see only Esteban. It is not Esteban, hissed the girl. It is Lord Greystoke himself. It is Tarzan of the Apes. You are mad, Flora, replied the man. It cannot be he. It is he, though, she insisted. Do you suppose that I do not know him? Did I not work in his townhouse for years? Did I not see him nearly every day? Do you suppose that I do not know Tarzan of the Apes? Look at that red scar flaming on his forehead. I have heard the story of that scar, and I have seen it burn scarlet when he was aroused to anger. It is scarlet now, and Tarzan of the Apes is angry. Well, suppose it is Tarzan of the Apes. What can he do? You do not know him, replied the girl. You do not guess the tremendous power he wields here, the power of life and death over man and beast. If he knew our mission here, not one of us would ever reach the coast alive. The very fact that he is here now makes me believe that he may have discovered our purpose, and if he has, God help us, unless what? Demanded the man. The girl was silent in thought for a moment. There is only one way, she said finally. We dare not kill him. His savage blacks would learn of it, and no power on earth could save us then. There is a way, though, if we act quickly. She turned and searched for a moment in one of her bags, and presently she handed the man a small bottle containing liquid. Go out and talk to him, she said. Make friends with him. Lie to him. Tell him anything. Promise anything. But get on friendly enough terms with him so that you can offer him coffee. He does not drink wine or anything with alcohol in it, but I know that he likes coffee. I have often served it to him in his room late at night upon his return from the theatre or a ball. Get him to drink coffee, and then you will know what to do with this. And she indicated the bottle which the man still held in his hand. Krasky nodded. I understand, he said, and turning, left the tent. He had taken but a step when the girl recalled him. Do not let him see me. Do not let him guess that I am here or that you know me. The man nodded and left her. Approaching the tense figures before the fire, he greeted Tarzan with a pleasant smile and a cheery word. Welcome, he said. We are always glad to see a stranger in our camp. Sit down, hand the gentleman a stool, John, he said to Peebles. The ape-man eyed Krasky as he had eyed the others. There was no answering, friendly light in his eyes, responding to the Russian's greeting. I have been trying to find out what your party is doing here, he said sharply to the Russian, but they still insist that I am someone whom I am not. They are either fools or knaves, and I intend to find out which and deal with them accordingly. Come, come, cried Krasky soothingly. There must be some mistake, I am sure. But tell me, who are you? I am Tarzan of the Apes, replied the ape-man. No hunters enter this part of Africa without my permission. That fact is so well known that there is no chance of your having passed the coast without having been so advised. I seek an explanation, and that quickly. Ah, you are Tarzan of the Apes, exclaimed Krasky. Fortunate indeed are we, for now may we be set straight upon our way. An escape from our frightful dilemma is assured. We are lost, sir, inextricably lost, due to the ignorance or knavery of our guide, who deserted us several weeks ago. Surely we knew of you, who does not know of Tarzan of the Apes. But it was not our intention to cross the boundaries of your territory. We were searching farther south for specimens of the fauna of the district, which our good friend and employer here, Mr. Adolf Bluber, is collecting at great expense for presentation to a museum in his home city in America. Now I am sure that you can tell us where we are and direct us upon our proper course. Peebles, Throck, and Bluber stood fascinated by Krasky's glib lies, but it was the German Jew who first rose to the occasion. Too thick were the skulls of the English pugs to grasp quickly the clever ruse of the Russian. Why, yes, said the oily Bluber, rubbing his palms together. Dot is it. Just what I was going to tell you. Tarzan turned sharply upon him. Then what was all this talk about Esteban, he asked. Was it not by that name that these others addressed me? Ah, cried Bluber, John will have his little joke. He is ignorant of Africa. He has never been here before. He thought perhaps that you were a native. John, he calls all the natives Esteban, and he has great jokes by himself mit them, because he knows they cannot understand what he says. "Hey, John, is it not so? What it is I say." But the shrewd Bloober did not wait for John to reply. "You see," he went on, "we are lost, and you take us who admit this jungle, for pay you anything. You name your own price." The ape-man only half believed him, yet he was somewhat mollified by their evidently friendly intentions. Perhaps after all they were telling him a half-truth and had really wandered into his territory unwittingly. That, however, he would find out definitely from their native carriers, from whom his own waziri would wean the truth. But the matter of his having been mistaken for Esteban still piqued his curiosity. Also, he was still desirous of learning the identity of the slayer of Gobu, the great ape. "Please sit down," urged Krasky. "We were about to have coffee, and we should be delighted to have you join us. We meant no wrong in coming here, and I can assure you that we will gladly and willingly make full amends to you, or to whomever else we may have unintentionally wronged. To take coffee with these men would do no harm. Perhaps he had wronged them, but however that might be, a cup of their coffee would place no great obligation upon him." Flora had been right in her assertion that if Tarzan of the Apes had any weakness whatsoever, it was for an occasional cup of black coffee late at night. He did not accept the proffered campstool, but squatted, ape-fashion, before them, the flickering light of the beast fires playing upon his bronzed hide and bringing into relief the gracefully contoured muscles of his godlike frame. Not as the muscles of the blacksmith or the professional strong man were the muscles of Tarzan of the Apes, but rather those of Mercury or Apollo, so symmetrically balanced were their proportions, suggesting only the great strength that lay in them. Trained to speed and agility were they as well as to strength, and thus clothing as they did his giant frame, they imparted to him the appearance of a demigod. Throck, Peebles, and Bloober sat watching him in spellbound fascination, while Krasky walked over to the cook fire to arrange for the coffee. The two Englishmen were as yet only half awakened to the fact that they had mistaken this newcomer for another, and as it was, Peebles still scratched his head and grumbled to himself in inarticulate half-denial of Krasky's assumption of the new identity of Tarzan. Bloober was inwardly terror-stricken. His keener intelligence had quickly grasped the truth of Krasky's recognition of the man for what he was, rather than for what Peebles and Throck thought him to be, and as Bloober knew nothing of Flora's plan, he was in quite a state of funk as he tried to visualize the outcome of Tarzan's discovery of them at the very threshold of Opar. He did not realize, as did Flora, that their very lives were in danger, that it was Tarzan of the Apes, a beast of the jungle, with whom they had to deal, and not John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, an English peer. Rather was Bloober considering the £2,000 that they stood to lose through this deplorable termination of their expedition, for he was sufficiently familiar with the reputation of the ape-man to know that they would never be permitted to take with them the gold that Esteban was very likely at this moment pilfering from the vaults of Opar. Really, Bloober was almost upon the verge of tears when Krasky returned with the coffee, which he brought himself. From the dark shadows of the tent's interior, Flora Hawkes looked nervously out upon the scene before her. She was terrified at the possibility of discovery by her former employer, for she had been a maid in the Greystokes' London townhouse, as well as at the African bungalow, and knew that Lord Greystoke would recognize her instantly should he chance to see her. She entertained for him now, in his jungle haunts, a fear that was possibly greater than Tarzan's true character warranted, but none the less real was it to the girl whose guilty conscience conjured all sorts of possible punishments for her disloyalty to those who had always treated her with uniform kindliness and consideration. constant dreaming of the fabulous wealth of the treasure vaults of Opar, concerning which she had heard so much in detail from the conversations of the Greystokes, had aroused within her naturally crafty and unscrupulous mind a desire for possession, and in consequence thereof, she had slowly visualized a scheme whereby she might loot the treasure vaults of a sufficient number of the golden ingots to make her independently wealthy for life. The entire plan had been hers. She had at first interested Krasky, who had in turn enlisted the cooperation of the two Englishmen and Bluber, and these four had raised the necessary money to defray the cost of the expedition. It had been Flora who had searched for a type of man who might successfully impersonate Tarzan in his own jungle, and she had found Esteban Miranda, a handsome, powerful, and unscrupulous Spaniard, whose histrionic ability, aided by the art of makeup, of which he was a past master, permitted him to almost faultlessly impersonate the character they desired him to portray, in so far, as least, as outward appearances were concerned. The Spaniard was not only powerful and active, but physically courageous as well, and since he had shaved his beard and donned the jungle habiliments of a Tarzan, he had lost no opportunity for emulating the ape-man in every way that lay within his ability. Of jungle craft he had none, of course, and personal combats with the more savage jungle beasts caution prompted him to eschew, but he hunted the lesser game with spear and with arrow, and practiced continually with the grass rope that was a part of his make-up. And now Flora Hawkes saw all her well-laid plans upon the verge of destruction. She trembled as she watched the men before the fire, for her fear of Tarzan was very real, and then she became tense with nervous anticipation as she saw Krasky approaching the group with the coffee pot in one hand and cups in the other. Krasky set the pot and the cups upon the ground a little in the rear of Tarzan, and as he filled the latter, she saw him pour a portion of the contents of the bottle she had given him into one of the cups. A cold sweat broke out upon her forehead as Krasky lifted this cup and offered it to the ape-man. Would he take it? Would he suspect? If he did suspect, what horrible punishment would be meted to them all for their temerity? She saw Krasky hand another cup to Peebles, Throck, and Bluber, then return to the circle with the last one for himself. As the Russian raised it before his face and bowed politely to the ape-man, she saw the five men drink. The reaction which ensued left her weak and spent. Turning, she collapsed upon her cot and lay there trembling, her face buried in her arm. And outside, Tarzan of the Apes drained his cup to the last drop. Chapter 6. Death Steals Behind. During the afternoon of the day that Tarzan discovered the camp of the conspirators, a watcher upon the crumbling outer wall of the ruined city of Opar descried a party of men moving downward into the valley from the summit of the encircling cliff. Tarzan, Jane Clayton, and their black Waziri were the only strangers that the denizens of Opar had ever seen within their valley during the lifetime of the oldest among them, and only in half-forgotten legends of a bygone past was there any suggestion that strangers other than these had ever visited Opar. Yet from time immemorial, a guard had always remained upon the summit of the outer wall. Now a single, knurled and crippled man-like creature was all that recalled the numerous lithe warriors of lost Atlantis. For down through the long ages, the race had deteriorated, and finally, through occasional mating with the great apes, the men had become the beast-like things of modern Opar. Strange and inexplicable had been the providence of nature that had confined this deterioration almost solely to the males, leaving the females straight, well-formed, often of comely and even beautiful features, a condition that might be largely attributable to the fact that female infants possessing ape-like characteristics were immediately destroyed, while, on the other hand, boy babies who possessed purely human attributes were also done away with. Typical indeed of the male inhabitants of Opar was the lone watcher upon the outer city wall, a short, stocky man with matted hair and beard, his tangled locks growing low upon a low receding forehead. Small, close-set eyes and fang-like teeth bore evidence of his simian ancestry, as did his short, crooked legs and long, muscular, ape-like arms, all scantily hair-covered, as was his torso. As his wicked, blood-rimmed eyes watched the progress of the party across the valley toward Opar, evidences of his growing excitement were manifested in the increased rapidity of his breathing and low, almost inaudible growls that issued from his throat. The strangers were too far distant to be recognizable only as human beings, and their number to be roughly approximated as between 2 and 3 score. Having assured himself of these two facts, the watcher descended from the outer wall, crossed the space between it and the inner wall, through which he passed, and at a rapid trot crossed the broad avenue beyond, and disappeared within the crumbling but still magnificent temple beyond. Kaj, the high priest of Opar, squatted beneath the shade of the giant trees, which now overgrew what had once been one of the gardens of the ancient temple. With him were a dozen members of the lesser priesthood, the intimate cronies of the high priest, who were startled by the sudden advent of one of the inferior members of the clan of Opar. The fellow hurried breathlessly to Kaj. "Kaj," he cried, "strange men descend upon Opar. From the northwest they have come into the valley from beyond the barrier cliffs, 50 of them at least, perhaps half again that number. I saw them as I watched from the summit of the outer wall, but further than they are men I cannot say, for they are still a great distance away. Not since the great Tarmangani came among us last have there been strangers within Opar. It has been many moons since the great Tarmangani, who called himself Tarzan of the apes, was among us," said Kaj. "He promised us to return before the rain to see that no harm had befallen La. But he did not come back, and La has always insisted that he is dead. Have you told any other of what you have seen?" he demanded, turning suddenly upon the messenger. "No," replied the latter. "Good," exclaimed Kaj. "Come, we will all go to the outer wall and see who it is who dares enter forbidden Opar, and let no one breathe a word of what Blah has told us until I give permission." "The word of Kaj is law until La speaks," murmured one of the priests. Kaj turned a scowling face upon the speaker. "I am High Priest of Opar," he growled. "Who dares disobey me?" "But La is High Priestess," said one, "and the High Priestess is the Queen of Opar." "But the High Priest can offer whom he will as sacrifice in the chamber of the dead or to the flaming god," Kaj reminded the other meaningly. "We shall keep silence, Kaj," replied the priest, cringing. "Good," growled the high priest, and led the way from the garden through the corridors of the temple back toward the outer wall of Opar. From here, they watched the approaching party that was in plain view of them, far out across the valley. The watchers conversed in low gutturals in the language of the great apes, interspersed with which were occasional words and phrases of a strange tongue that were doubtless corrupted forms of the ancient language of Atlantis, handed down through countless generations from their human progenitors, that now extinct race whose cities and civilization lie buried deep beneath the tossing waves of the Atlantic, and whose adventurous spirit had, in remote ages, caused them to penetrate into the heart of Africa in search of gold, and to build there, in duplication of their far home cities, the magnificent city of Opar. As Kaj and his followers watched from beneath shaggy brows, the strangers plodding laboriously beneath the now declining equatorial sun across the rocky, barren valley, a grey little monkey eyed them from amidst the foliage of one of the giant trees that had forced its way through the pavement of the ancient avenue behind them. A solemn, sad-faced little monkey it was, but like all his kind overcome by curiosity, and finally to such an extent that his fear of the fierce males of Opar was so considerably overcome that he at last swung lightly from the tree to the pavement, made his way through the inner wall and up the inside of the outer wall to a position in their rear where he could hide behind one of the massive granite blocks of the crumbling wall in comparative safety from detection, the while he might overhear the conversation of the Oparians, all of which that was carried on in the language of the great apes he could understand perfectly. The afternoon was drawing to a close before the slowly moving company approaching Opar was close enough for individuals to be recognizable in any way, and then presently one of the younger priests exclaimed excitedly, "It is he, Kaj. It is the great Tarmangani who calls himself Tarzan of the Apes. I can see him plainly. The others are all black men. He is urging them on, prodding them with his spear. They act as though they were afraid and very tired, but he is forcing them forward." "You are sure?" demanded Kaj. "You are sure that it is Tarzan of the Apes?" "I am positive," replied the speaker, and then another of the priests joined his assurances to that of his fellow. At last they were close enough so that Kaj himself, whose eyesight was not as good as that of the younger members of the company, realized that it was indeed Tarzan of the Apes who was returning to Opar. The high priest scowled angrily in thought. Suddenly he turned upon the others. "He must not come," he cried. "He must not enter Opar. Hasten and fetch 100 fighting men. We will meet them as they come through the outer wall and slay them one by one." "But La!" cried he, who had aroused Kaj's anger in the garden. "I distinctly recall that La offered the friendship of Opar to Tarzan of the Apes upon that time, many moons ago, that he saved her from the tusks of infuriated Tantor." "Silence," growled Kaj. "He shall not enter. We shall slay them all, though we need not know their identity until it is too late. Do you understand? And know, too, that whosoever attempts to thwart my purpose shall die, and he die not as a sacrifice, he shall die at my hands, but die he shall. You hear me?" And he pointed an unclean finger at the trembling priest. Manu, the monkey, hearing all this, was almost bursting with excitement. He knew Tarzan of the Apes. As all the migratory monkeys the length and breadth of Africa knew him, he knew him for a friend and protector. To Manu, the males of Opar were neither beast, nor man, nor friend. He knew them as cruel and surly creatures who ate the flesh of his kind, and he hated them accordingly. He was therefore greatly exercised at the plot that he had heard discussed, which was aimed at the life of the great Tarmangani. He scratched his little grey head and the root of his tail and his belly as he attempted to mentally digest what he had heard and bring forth, from the dim recesses of his little brain, a plan to foil the priests and save Tarzan of the Apes. He made grotesque grimaces that were aimed at the unsuspecting Kaj and his followers, but which failed to perturb them, possibly because a huge granite block hid the little monkey from them. This was quite the most momentous thing that had occurred in the life of Manu. He wanted to jump up and down, and dance, and screech, and jabber, to scold and threaten the hated Oparians, but something told him that nothing would be gained by this, other than perhaps to launch in his direction a shower of granite missiles, which the priests knew only too well how to throw with accuracy. Now Manu is not a deep thinker, but upon this occasion he quite outdid himself, and managed to concentrate his mind upon the thing at hand, rather than permit its being distracted by each falling leaf or buzzing insect. He even permitted a succulent caterpillar to crawl within his reach and out again with impunity. Just before darkness fell, Kaj saw a little grey monkey disappear over the summit of the outer wall, 50 paces from where he crouched with his fellows, waiting for the coming of the fighting men. But so numerous were the monkeys about the ruins of Opar that the occurrence left Kaj's mind almost as quickly as the monkey disappeared from his view, and in the gathering gloom he did not see the little grey figure scampering off across the valley toward the band of intruders, who now appeared to have stopped to rest at the foot of a large kopje that stood alone out in the valley, about a mile from the city. Little Manu was very much afraid out there alone in the growing dusk, and he scampered very fast with his tail bowed up and out behind him. All the time he cast affrighted glances to the right and left. The moment he reached the kopje, he scampered up its face as fast as he could. It was really a huge, precipitous granite rock with almost perpendicular sides, but sufficiently weather-worn to make its ascent easy to little Manu. He paused a moment at the summit to get his breath and still the beatings of his frightened little heart. And then he made his way around to a point where he could look down upon the party beneath. There, indeed, was the great Tarmangani Tarzan, and with him were some 50 Gomangani. The latter were splicing together a number of long, straight poles, which they had laid upon the ground in 2 parallel lines. Across these two, at intervals of a foot or more, they were lashing smaller straight branches about 18 inches in length, the whole forming a crude but substantial ladder. The purpose of all this Manu, of course, did not understand, nor did he know that it had been evolved from the fertile brain of Flora Hawks as a means of scaling the precipitous kopje, at the summit of which lay the outer entrance to the treasure vaults of Opar. Nor did Manu know that the party had no intention of entering the city of Opar and were therefore in no danger of becoming victims of Kaj's hidden assassins. To him, the danger to Tarzan of the Apes was very real, and so, having regained his breath, he lost no time in delivering his warning to the friend of his people. "Tarzan," he cried in the language that was common to both. The white man and the blacks looked up at the sound of his chattering voice. "It is Manu Tarzan," continued the little monkey, "who has come to tell you not to go to Opar. Kaj and his people await within the outer wall to slay you." The blacks, having discovered that the author of the disturbance was nothing but a little grey monkey, returned immediately to their work, while the white man similarly ignored his words of warning. Manu was not surprised at the lack of interest displayed by the blacks, for he knew that they did not understand his language, but he could not comprehend why Tarzan failed to pay any attention whatsoever to him. Again and again he called Tarzan by name. Again and again he shrieked his warning to the ape-man, but without eliciting any reply or any information that the great Tarmangani had either heard or understood him. Manu was mystified. What had occurred to render Tarzan of the Apes so indifferent to the warnings of his old friend? At last, the little monkey gave it up and looked longingly back in the direction of the trees within the walled city of Opar. It was now very dark, and he trembled at the thought of recrossing the valley, where he knew enemies might prowl by night. He scratched his head and he hugged his knees, then sat there whimpering, a very forlorn and unhappy little ball of a monkey. But however uncomfortable he was upon the high kopje, he was comparatively safe, and so he decided to remain there during the night rather than venture the terrifying return trip through the darkness. Thus it was that he saw the ladder completed and erected against the side of the kopje, and when the moon rose at last and lighted the scene, he saw Tarzan of the Apes urging his men to mount the ladder. He had never seen Tarzan thus rough and cruel with the blacks who accompanied him. Manu knew how ferocious the great Tarmangani could be with an enemy, whether man or beast, but he had never seen him accord such treatment to the blacks who were his friends. One by one, and with evident reluctance, the blacks ascended the ladder, continually urged forward to greater speed by the sharp spear of the white man. When they had all ascended, Tarzan followed, and Manu saw them disappear, apparently into the heart of the great rock. It was only a short time later that they commenced to reappear, and now each was burdened by two heavy objects which appeared to Manu to be very similar to some of the smaller stone blocks that had been used in the construction of the buildings in Opar. He saw them take the blocks to the edge of the kopje and cast them over to the ground beneath, and when the last of the blacks had emerged with his load and cast it to the valley below, one by one, the party descended the ladder to the foot of the kopje. But this time, Tarzan of the Apes went first. Then they lowered the ladder and took it apart and laid its pieces close to the foot of the cliff, after which they took up the blocks which they had brought from the heart of the kopje, and following Tarzan, who set out in the lead, they commenced to retrace their steps toward the rim of the valley. Manu would have been very much mystified had he been a man, but being only a monkey, he saw only what he saw, without attempting to reason very much about it. He knew that the ways of men were peculiar and oftentimes unaccountable. For example, the Gomangani, who could not travel through the jungle and the forest with the ease of any other of the animals which frequented them, added to their difficulties by loading themselves down with additional weights in the form of metal anklets and armlets, with necklaces and girdles, and with skins of animals, which did nothing more than impede their progress and render life much more complicated than that which the untrammeled beasts enjoyed. Manu, whenever he gave the matter a thought, congratulated himself that he was not a man. He pitied the foolish, unreasonable creatures. Manu must have slept. He thought that he had only closed his eyes a moment, but when he opened them, the rosy light of dawn had overspread the desolate valley. Just disappearing over the cliffs to the northeast, he could see the last of Tarzan's party commencing the descent of the barrier. Then Manu turned his face toward Opar and prepared to descend from the kopje and scamper back to the safety of his trees within the walls of Opar. But first, he would reconnoiter. Sheeta, the panther, might be still abroad, and so he scampered around the edge of the kopje to a point where he could see the entire valley floor between himself and Opar. And there it was that he saw again that which filled him with greatest excitement. For debouching from the ruined outer wall of Opar was a large company of Opar's frightful men. Fully 100 of them Manu could have counted had Manu been able to count. They seemed to be coming toward the kopje, and he sat and watched them as they approached, deciding to defer his return to the city until after the path was cleared of hated Oparians. It occurred to him that they were coming after him, for the egotism of the lower animals is inordinate. Because he was a monkey, the idea did not seem at all ridiculous, and so he hid behind a jutting rock, with only one little, bright eye exposed to the enemy. He saw them come closer, and he grew very much excited, though he was not at all afraid, for he knew that if they ascended one side of the kopje, he could descend the other and be halfway to Opar before they could possibly locate him again. On and on they came, but they did not stop at the kopje. As a matter of fact, they did not come very close to it, but continued on beyond it. Then it was that the truth of the matter flashed into the little brain of the monkey. Kaj and his people were pursuing Tarzan of the apes to slay him. If Manu had been offended by Tarzan's indifference to him upon the night before, he had evidently forgotten it, for now he was quite as excited about the danger which he saw menace the ape-man as he had been upon the afternoon previous. At first he thought of running ahead and again warning Tarzan, but he feared to venture so far from the trees of Opar, even if the thought of having to pass the hated Oparians had not been sufficient to deter him from carrying out this plan. For a few minutes he sat watching them, until they had all passed the kopje, and then it became quite clear to him that they were heading directly for the spot at which the last of Tarzan's party had disappeared from the valley. There could be no doubt that they were in pursuit of the ape-man. Manu scanned the valley once more toward Opar. There was nothing in sight to deter him from an attempted return, and so, with the agility of his kind, he scampered down the vertical face of the kopje and was off, at great speed, toward the city's wall. Just when he formulated the plan that he eventually followed it is difficult to say. Perhaps he thought it all out as he sat upon the kopje, watching Kaj and his people upon the trail of the ape-man. Or perhaps it occurred to him while he was scampering across the barren waste toward Opar. It may just have popped into his mind from a clear sky after he had regained the leafy sanctuary of his own trees. Be that, however, as it may, the fact remains that as La, High Priestess and Princess of Opar, in company with several of her priestesses, was bathing in a pool in one of the temple gardens, she was startled by the screaming of a monkey, swinging frantically by his tail from the branch of a great tree which overspread the pool. It was a little grey monkey with a face so wise and serious that one might easily have imagined that the fate of nations lay constantly upon the shoulders of its owner. "La, la," it screamed, "they have gone to kill Tarzan! They have gone to kill Tarzan!" At the sound of that name, La was instantly all attention. Standing waist-deep in the pool, she looked up at the little monkey questioningly. "What do you mean, Manu?" she asked. "It has been many moons since Tarzan was at Opar. He is not here now. What are you talking about?" "I saw him," screamed Manu. "I saw him last night with many Gomangani. He came to the great rock that lies in the valley before Opar. With all his men, he climbed to the top of it, went into the heart of it, and came out with stones, which they threw down into the valley. Afterward, they descended from the rock and picked up the stones again and left the valley there." And Manu pointed towards the northeast with one of his hairy little fingers. "How do you know it was Tarzan of the apes?" asked La. "Does Manu not know his cousin and his friend?" demanded the monkey. "With my eyes I saw him. It was Tarzan of the apes." La of Opar puckered her brows in thought. Deep in her heart smouldered the fires of her great love for Tarzan. Fires that had been quenched by the necessity that had compelled her marriage with Kaj since last she had seen the ape-man. For it is written among the laws of Opar that the high priestess of the flaming god must take a mate within a certain number of years after her consecration. For many moons had La longed to make Tarzan that mate. The ape-man had not loved her, and finally she had come to a realization that he could never love her. Afterward, she had bowed to the frightful fate that had placed her in the arms of Kaj. As month after month had passed and Tarzan had not returned to Opar, as he had promised he would do, to see that no harm befell La, she had come to accept the opinion of Kaj that the ape-man was dead, and though she hated the repulsive Kaj nonetheless, Her love for Tarzan had gradually become little more than a sorrowful memory. Now, to learn that he was alive and had been so near was like reopening an old wound. At first she comprehended little else than that Tarzan had been close to Opar, but presently the cries of Manu aroused her to a realization that the ape-man was in danger. Just what the danger was, she did not know. "Who has gone to kill Tarzan of the apes?" she demanded suddenly. "Kaj, Kaj," shrieked Manu. "He has gone with many, many men and is following upon the spoor of Tarzan." La sprang quickly from the pool, seized her girdle and ornaments from her attendant, and adjusting them hurriedly, sped through the garden and into the temple. Chapter 7. You must sacrifice him. Warily Kaj and his 100 frightful followers, armed with their bludgeons and knives, crept stealthily down the face of the barrier into the valley below, upon the trail of the white man and his black companions. They made no haste, for they had noted from the summit of Opar's outer wall that the party they were pursuing moved very slowly, though why they did not know, for they had been at too great a distance to see the burden that each of the blacks carried. Nor was it Kaj's desire to overtake his quarry by daylight, his plans contemplating a stealthy night attack, the suddenness of which, together with the great number of his followers, might easily confuse and overwhelm a sleeping camp. The spoor they followed was well marked. There could be no mistaking it, and they moved slowly down the now gentle declivity toward the bottom of the valley. It was close to noon that they were brought to a sudden halt by the discovery of a thorn boma recently constructed in a small clearing just ahead of them. From the center of the boma arose the thin smoke of a dying fire. Here, then, was the camp of the ape-man. Kaj drew his followers into the concealment of the thick bushes that bordered the trail, and from there he sent ahead a single man to reconnoiter. It was but a few moments later that the latter returned to say that the camp was deserted, and once again Kaj moved forward with his men. Entering the boma, they examined it in an effort to estimate the size of the party that accompanied Tarzan. As they were thus occupied, Kaj saw something lying half-concealed by bushes at the far end of the boma. Very warily he approached it, for there was that about it which not only aroused his curiosity but prompted him to caution, for it resembled indistinctly the figure of a man lying huddled upon the ground. With ready bludgeons, a dozen of them approached the thing that had aroused Kaj's curiosity, and when they had come close to it, they saw lying before them the lifeless figure of Tarzan of the apes. "The flaming god has reached forth to avenge his desecrated altar," cried the high priest, his eyes glowing with the maniacal fires of fanaticism. But another priest, more practical perhaps, or at least more cautious, kneeled beside the figure of the ape-man and placed his ear against the latter's heart. "He is not dead," he whispered. "Perhaps he only sleeps." "Seize him, then, quickly," cried Kaj, and an instant later Tarzan's body was covered by the hairy forms of as many of the frightful men as could pile upon him. He offered no resistance. He did not even open his eyes, and presently his arms were securely bound behind him. "Drag him forth, where the eye of the flaming god may rest upon him," cried Kaj. They dragged Tarzan out into the center of the boma, into the full light of the sun, and Kaj, the high priest, drawing his knife from his loincloth, raised it above his head and stood over the prostrate form of his intended victim. Kaj's followers formed a rough circle about the ape-man, and some of them pressed close behind their leader. They appeared uneasy, looking alternately at Tarzan and their high priest, and then casting furtive glances at the sun, riding high in a cloud-mottled sky. But whatever the thoughts that troubled their half-savage brains, there was only one who dared voice his, and he was the same priest who, upon the preceding day, had questioned Kadj's proposal to slay the ape-man. "Kadj," he said now, "who are you to offer up a sacrifice to the flaming god? It is the privilege alone of La, our high priestess and our queen, and indeed will she be angry when she learns what you have done." "Silence, Dooth," cried Kadj. "I, Kadj, am the high priest of Opar. I, Kadj, am the mate of La, the queen. My word, too, is law in Opar, and you would remain a priest, and you would remain alive. Keep silence." "Your word is not law," replied Booth angrily, "and if you anger Lay, the high priestess, or if you anger the flaming god, you may be punished as another. If you make this sacrifice, both will be angry." "Enough," cried Kadj. "The flaming god has spoken to me and has demanded that I offer up as sacrifice this defiler of his temple." He knelt beside the ape-man and touched his breast above the heart with the point of his sharp blade, and then he raised the weapon high above him, preparatory to the fatal plunge into the living heart. At that instant, a cloud passed before the face of the sun, and a shadow rested upon them. A murmur rose from the surrounding priests. "Look," cried Dooth, "the flaming god is angry. He has hidden his face from the people of Opar." Kadj paused. He cast a half-defiant, half-frightened look at the cloud obscuring the face or the sun. Then he rose slowly to his feet, and extending his arms upward toward the hidden god of day, he remained for a moment silent, in apparently attentive and listening attitude. Then suddenly he turned upon his followers. "Priests of Opar," he cried, "the flaming god has spoken to his high priest, Kadj. He is not angered. He but wishes to speak to me alone, and he directs that you go away into the jungle and wait until he has come and spoken to Kadj, after which I shall call you to return. Go." For the most part, they seemed to accept the word of Kadj as law, but Dooth and a few others, doubtless prompted by a certain skepticism, hesitated. "Begone," commanded Kadj, and so powerful is the habit of obedience that the doubters finally turned away and melted into the jungle with the others. A crafty smile lighted the cruel face of the high priest as the last of them disappeared from sight, and then he once again turned his attention to the ape-man. That deep within his breast, however, lurked an inherent fear of his deity, was evidenced by the fact that he turned questioning glances toward the sky. He had determined to slay the ape-man while Dooth and the others were absent, yet the fear of his god restrained his hand until the light of his deity should shine forth upon him once more, and assure him that the thing he contemplated might meet with favor. It was a large cloud that overcast the sun, and while Kadj waited, his nervousness increased. 6 times he raised his knife for the fatal blow, yet in each instance his superstition prevented the consummation of the act. 5, 10, 15 minutes passed, and still the sun remained obscured. But now, at last, Kadj could see that it was nearing the edge of the cloud, and once again he took his position, kneeling beside the ape-man with his blade, ready for the moment that the sunlight should flood again, for the last time, the living Tarzan. He saw it sweeping slowly across the boma toward him, and as it came a look of demoniacal hatred shone in his close-set, wicked eyes. Another instant, and the flaming god would have set the seal of his approval upon the sacrifice. Kadj trembled in anticipation. He raised the knife a trifle higher, his muscles tensed for the downward plunge, and then the silence of the jungle was broken by a woman's voice, raised almost to a scream. Kaj, came the single word, but with all the suddenness and all the surprising effect of lightning from a clear sky. His knife still poised on high, the high priest turned in the direction of the interruption to see at the clearing's edge the figure of La, the high priestess, and behind her, Duth, and a score of the lesser priests. "What means this, Kaj?" demanded La angrily, approaching rapidly toward him across the clearing. Sullenly, the high priest rose. "The flaming god demanded the life of this unbeliever," he cried. "Speaker of lies," retorted La. "The flaming god communicates with men through the lips of his high priestess only. Too often already have you attempted to thwart the will of your queen. Know then, Kaj, that the power of life and death, which your queen holds, is as potent over you as another. During the long ages that Opar has endured, our legends tell us that more than one high priest has been offered upon the altar to the flaming god, and it is not unlikely that yet another may go the way of the presumptuous. Curb, therefore, your vanity and your lust for power, lest they prove your undoing." Kaj sheathed his knife and turned sullenly away, casting a venomous look at Duth, to whom he evidently attributed his undoing. That he was temporarily abashed by the presence of his queen was evident, but to those who knew Kaj, there was little doubt that he still harbored his intention to dispatch the ape-man, and if the opportunity ever presented itself, that he would do so, for Kaj had a strong following among the people and priests of Opar. There were many who doubted that La would ever dare to incur the displeasure and anger of so important a portion of her followers as to cause the death or degradation of their high priest, who occupied his office by virtue of laws and customs so old that their origin had been long lost in antiquity. For years, she had found first one excuse and then another to delay the ceremonies that would unite her in marriage to the high priest. She had further aroused the antagonism of her people by palpable proofs of her infatuation for the ape-man, and even though at last she had been compelled to mate with Kaj, she had made no effort whatsoever to conceal her hatred and loathing for the man. How much further she could go with impunity was a question that often troubled those whose position in Opar depended upon her favor. And knowing all these conditions as he did, it was not strange that Kaj should entertain treasonable thoughts toward his queen. Leagued with him in his treachery was Oa, a priestess who aspired to the power and offices of La. If La could be done away with, then Kaj had the influence to see that Oa became high priestess. He also had Oa's promise to mate with him and permit him to rule as king, but as yet both were bound by the superstitious fear of their flaming deity, and because of this fact was the life of La temporarily made safe. It required, however, but the slightest spark to ignite the flames of treason that were smoldering about her. So far, she was well within her rights in forbidding the sacrifice of Tarzan by the high priest, but her fate, her very life perhaps, depended upon her future treatment of the prisoner. Should she spare him? Should she evidence in any way a return of the great love she had once almost publicly avowed for him? It was likely that her doom would be sealed. It was even questionable whether or not she might with impunity spare his life and set him at liberty. Kaj and the others watched her closely now as she crossed to the side of Tarzan. Standing there silently for several moments, she looked down upon him. "He is already dead?" she asked. "He was not dead when Kaj sent us away," volunteered Duth. "If he is dead now, it is because Kaj killed him while we were away." "I did not kill him," said Kaj. "That remains, as La, our queen, has told you, for her to do. The eye of the flaming god looks down upon you, high priestess of Opar. The knife is at your hip. The sacrifice lies before you." La ignored the man's words and turned toward Duth. "If he still lives," she said, "construct a litter and bear him back to Opar." Thus, once more came Tarzan of the Apes into the ancient colonial city of the Atlanteans. The effects of the narcotic that Krasky had administered to him did not wear off for many hours. It was night when he opened his eyes, and for a moment he was bewildered by the darkness and the silence that surrounded him. All that he could scent at first was that he lay upon a pile of furs and that he was uninjured, for he felt no pain. Slowly there broke through the fog of his drugged brain recollection of the last moment before unconsciousness had overcome him, and presently he realized the trick that had been played upon him. For how long he had been unconscious, and where he then was, he could not imagine. Slowly he arose to his feet, finding that except for a slight dizziness, he was quite himself. Cautiously, he felt around in the darkness, moving with care, a hand outstretched and always feeling carefully with his feet for a secure footing. Almost immediately, a stone wall stopped his progress, and this he followed around 4 sides of what he soon realized was a small room in which there were but 2 openings, a door upon each of the opposite sides. Only his senses of touch and smell were of value to him here. These told him only at first that he was imprisoned in a subterranean chamber, but as the effects of the narcotic diminished, the keenness of the latter returned, and with its return, there was borne in upon Tarzan's brain an insistent impression of familiarity in certain fragrant odors that impinged upon his olfactory organs. A haunting suggestion that he had known them before under similar circumstances. Presently from above, through earth and masonry, came the shadow of an uncanny scream. Just the faintest suggestion of it reached the keen ears of the ape-man, but it was sufficient to flood his mind with vivid recollections and by association of ideas to fix the identity of the familiar odors about him. He knew at last that he was in the dark pit beneath Opar. Above him, in her chamber in the temple, La, the high priestess, tossed upon a sleepless couch. She knew all too well the temper of her people and the treachery of the high priest, Kaj. She knew the religious fanaticism which prompted the oft-time maniacal actions of her bestial and ignorant followers, and she guessed truly that Kaj would inflame them against her should she fail this time in sacrificing the ape-man to the flaming god. And it was the effort to find an escape from her dilemma that left her sleepless, for it was not in the heart of La to sacrifice Tarzan of the Apes, high priestess of a horrid cult, though she was, and queen of a race of half-beasts, yet she was a woman too, a woman who had loved but once, and given that love to the godlike ape-man who was again within her power. Twice before had he escaped her sacrificial knife. In the final instance, love had at last triumphed over jealousy and fanaticism, and La, the woman, had realized that never again could she place in jeopardy the life of the man she loved, however hopeless she knew that love to be. Tonight she was faced with a problem that she felt almost beyond her powers of solution. The fact that she was mated with Kaj removed the last vestige of hope that she had ever had of becoming the wife of the ape-man. Yet she was no less determined to save Tarzan if it were possible. Twice had he saved her life, once from a mad priest and once from Tantor in Must. Then, too, she had given her word that when Tarzan came again to Opar, he came in friendship and would be received in friendship. But the influence of Kaj was great, and she knew that that influence had been directed unremittingly against the ape-man. She had seen it in the attitude of her followers from the very moment that they had placed Tarzan upon a litter to bear him back to Opar. She had seen it in the evil glances that had been cast at her. Sooner or later they would dare denounce her. All that they needed was some slight new excuse that she knew they eagerly awaited in her forthcoming attitude toward Tarzan. It was well after midnight when there came to her one of the priestesses who remained always upon guard outside her chamber door. "Duth would speak with you," whispered the handmaiden. "It is late," replied La, "and men are not permitted in this part of the temple. How came he here, and why?" "He says that he comes in the service of La, who is in great danger," replied the girl. "Fetch him here, then," said La, "and as you value your life, see that you tell no one." "I shall be as voiceless as the stones of the altar," replied the girl, as she turned and left the chamber. A moment later, she returned, bringing Duth, who halted a few feet from the high priestess and saluted her. La signaled to the girl who had brought him to depart, and then she turned questioningly to the man. "Speak, Duth," she commanded. "We all know," he said, "of La's love for the strange ape-man, and it is not for me, a lesser priest, to question the thoughts or acts of my high priestess. It is only for me to serve, as those would do better to serve who now plot against you." "What do you mean, Duth? Who plots against me?" "Even at this minute are Kaj and Or, and several of the priests and priestesses carrying out a plan for your undoing. They are setting spies to watch you, knowing that you would liberate the ape-man, because there will come to you one who will tell you that to permit him to escape will be the easiest solution of your problem. This one will be sent by Kaj, and then those who watch you will report to the people and to the priests that they have seen you lead the sacrifice to liberty. But even that will avail you nothing, for Kaj and Oa and the others have placed upon the trail from Opar many men in hiding, who will fall upon the ape-man and slay him before the flaming god has descended twice into the western forest. In but one way, only may you save yourself, La of Opar." "And what is that way?" she asked. "You must, with your own hands, upon the altar of our temple, sacrifice the ape-man to the flaming god." Chapter 8. Mystery of the Past. L.A. had breakfasted the following morning and had sent Duth with food for Tarzan, when there came to her a young priestess who was the sister of Oa. Even before the girl had spoken, La knew that she was an emissary from Kaj, and that the treachery of which Duth had warned her was already underway. The girl was ill at ease and quite evidently frightened, for she was young and held in high revere. The queen, whom she had good reason to know, was all-powerful, and who might even inflict death upon her if she so wished. La, who had already determined upon a plan of action that she knew would be most embarrassing to Kaj and his conspirators, waited in silence for the girl to speak. But it was some time before the girl could muster up her courage or find a proper opening. Instead, she spoke of many things that had no bearing whatsoever upon her subject, and La, the high priestess, was amused at her discomfiture. "It is not often," said La, "that the sister of Oa comes to the apartments of her queen, unless she is bidden. I am glad to see that she at last realizes the service that she owes to the high priestess of the flaming god." "I come," said the girl at last, speaking almost as one who has learned apart, "to tell you that I have overheard that which may be of interest to you, and which I am sure that you will be glad to hear." "Yes?" interrogated La, raising her arched eyebrows. "I overheard Kaj speaking with the lesser priests," the girl continued, "and I distinctly heard him say that he would be glad if the ape-man escaped, as that would relieve you, and Kaj as well, of much embarrassment." I thought that La, the queen, would be glad to know this, for it is known by all of us that La has promised friendship to the ape-man and therefore does not wish to sacrifice him upon the altar of the flaming god. My duty is plain to me, replied La in a haughty voice, and I do not need Kaj nor any handmaiden to interpret it to me. I also know the prerogatives of a high priestess, and that the rite of sacrifice is one of them. For this reason, I prevented Kaj from sacrificing the stranger. No other hand than mine may offer his heart's blood to the flaming god, and upon the third day he shall die beneath my knife upon the altar of our temple. The effect of these words upon the girl were precisely what La had anticipated. She saw disappointment and chagrin written upon the face of Kaj's messenger, who now had no answer, for her instructions had not foreseen this attitude upon the part of La. Presently the girl found some lame pretext upon which to withdraw, and when she had left the presence of the high priestess, La could scarcely restrain a smile. She had no intention of sacrificing Tarzan, but this, of course, the sister of Oar did not know. So she returned to Kaj and repeated as nearly as she could recall it all that La had said to her. The high priest was much chagrined, for his plan had been now not so much to encompass the destruction of Tarzan as to lead La into the commission of an act that would bring upon her the wrath of the priests and people of Opar, who, properly instigated, would demand her life in expiation. Oh, who was present when her sister returned, bit her lips, for great was her disappointment. Never before had she seen so close at hand the longed-for possibility of becoming high priestess. For several minutes she paced to and fro in deep thought, and then suddenly she halted before Kaj. La loves this ape-man, she said, and even though she may sacrifice him, it is only because of fear of her people. She loves him still, loves him better, Kaj, than she has ever loved you. The ape-man knows it and trusts her, and because he knows it, there is a way. Listen, Kaj, to Oar. We will send one to the ape-man, who shall tell him that she comes from La, and that La has instructed her to lead him out of Opar and set him free. This one shall lead him into our ambush, and when he is killed we shall go, many of us, before La, and accuse her of treachery. The one who led the ape-man from Opar shall say that La ordered her to do it, and the priests and the people will be very angry, and then you shall demand the life of La. It will be very easy, and we shall be rid of both of them. Good, exclaimed Kaj. We shall do this thing at dawn upon the morrow, and before the flaming god goes to his rest at night, he shall look upon a new high priestess in Opar. That night, Tarzan was aroused from his sleep by a sound at one of the doors of his prison cell. He heard the bolt slipped back and the door creak slowly open upon its ancient hinges. In the inky darkness, he could discern no presence, but he heard the stealthy movement of sandaled feet upon the concrete floor, and then out of the darkness his name was whispered in a woman's voice. I am here, he replied. Who are you, and what do you want of Tarzan of the Apes? Your life is in danger, replied the voice. Come, follow me. Who sent you? Demanded the ape-man, his sensitive nostrils searching for a clue to the identity of the nocturnal visitor, but so heavily was the air laden with the pungent odor of some heavy perfume with which the body of the woman seemed to have been anointed, that there was no distinguishing clue by which he might judge as to whether she was one of the priestesses he had known upon the occasion of his former visits to Opar, or an entire stranger to him. La sent me, she said, to lead you from the pits of Opar to the freedom of the outside world beyond the city's walls. Groping in the darkness, she finally found him. Here are your weapons, she said. handing them to him. And then she took his hand, turned, and led him from the dungeon, through a long, winding, and equally black corridor, down flights of age-old concrete steps, through passages and corridors, opening and closing door after door that creaked and groaned upon rusty hinges. How far they travelled thus, and in what direction, Tarzan could not guess. He had gleaned enough from Duth, when the latter brought him his food, to believe that in La he had a friend who would aid him, for Duth had told him that she had saved him from Kaj when the latter had discovered him unconscious in the deserted boma of the Europeans who had drugged and left him. And so, the woman having said that she came from La, Tarzan followed her willingly. He could not but recall Jane's prophecy of the evils that he might expect to befall him should he persist in undertaking this third trip to Opar, and he wondered if, after all, his wife was right, that he should never again escape from the toils of the fanatical priests of the flaming god. He had not, of course, expected to enter Opar, but there seemed to hang over the accursed city a guardian demon that threatened the life of whosoever dared approach the forbidden spot or wrest from the forgotten treasure vaults a portion of their great hoard. For more than an hour, his guide led him through the Stygian darkness of underground passages, until, ascending a flight of steps, they emerged into the center of a clump of bushes, through which the pale light of the moon was barely discernible. The fresh air, however, told him that they had reached the surface of the ground, and now the woman, who had not spoken a word since she had led him from his cell, continued on in silence, following a devious trail that wound hither and thither in an erratic fashion through a heavy forest choked with undergrowth, and always upward. From the location of the stars and moon, and from the upward trend of the trail, Tarzan knew that he was being led into the mountains that lie behind Opar, a place he had never thought of visiting since the country appeared rough and uninviting and not likely to harbor game such as Tarzan cared most to hunt. He was already surprised by the nature of the vegetation, for he had thought the hills barren except for stunted trees and scraggy bush. As they continued upon their way, climbing ever upward, the moon rose higher in the heavens until its soft light revealed more clearly to the keen eyes of the ape-man the topography of the country they were traversing, and then it was that he saw they were ascending a narrow, thickly wooded gorge, and he understood why the heavy vegetation had been invisible from the plain before Opar. Himself naturally uncommunicative, the woman's silence made no particular impression upon Tarzan. Had he had anything to say, he should have said it, and likewise he assumed that there was no necessity for her speaking unless there was some good reason for speaking. For those who travel far and fast have no breath to waste upon conversation. The eastern stars were fading at the first hint of coming dawn, when the two scrambled up a precipitous bank that formed the upper end of the ravine and came out upon comparatively level ground. As they advanced, the sky lightened, and presently the woman halted at the edge of a declivity, and as the day broke, Tarzan saw below him a wooded basin in the heart of the mountain, and showing through the trees at what appeared to be some 2 or 3 miles distant, the outlines of a building that glistened and sparkled and scintillated in the light of the new sun. Then he turned and looked at his companion, and surprise and consternation were writ upon his face, for standing before him was La, the high priestess of Opar. "You," he exclaimed, "now indeed will Kaji have the excuse that Duth said he sought to put you out of the way." "He will never have the opportunity to put me out of the way," replied La, "for I shall never return to Opar." Never return to Opar, he exclaimed. Then where are you going? Where can you go? I am going with you, she replied. I do not ask that you love me. I only ask that you take me away from Opar and from the enemies who would slay me. There was no other way. Manu, the monkey, overheard them plotting, and he came to me and told me all that they would do. Whether I saved you or sacrificed you, it had all been the same with me. They were determined to do away with me, that might be High Priestess and Kaj King of Opar. But I should not have sacrificed you, Tarzan, under any circumstances, and this, then, seemed the only way in which we might both be saved. We could not go to the north or the west across the plain of Opar, for their Kaj has placed warriors in ambush to waylay you, and though you be Tarzan and a mighty fighter, they would overwhelm you by their very numbers and slay you. But where are you leading me? Asked Tarzan. I have chosen the lesser of two evils. In this direction lies an unknown country, filled for us Oparians with legends of grim monsters and strange people. Never has an Oparian ventured here and returned again to Opar. But if there lives in all the world a creature who could win through this unknown valley, it be you, Tarzan of the Apes. But if you know nothing of this country, or its inhabitants, demanded Tarzan, how is it that you so well know the trail that leads to it? We well know the trail to the summit, but that is as far as I have ever been before. The great apes and the lions use this trail when they come down into Opar. The lions, of course, cannot tell us where it leads, and the great apes will not, for usually we are at war with them. Along this trail, they come down into Opar to steal our people, and upon this trail we await to capture them. For often we offer a great ape in sacrifice to the flaming god, or rather, that was our former custom. But for many years they have been too wary for us, the toll being upon the other side, though we do not know for what purpose they steal our people, unless it be that they eat them. They are a very powerful race, standing higher than Bolgani, the gorilla, and infinitely more cunning. For, as there is ape blood in our veins, so is there human blood in the veins of these great apes that dwell in the valley above Opar. Why is it, that we must pass through this valley in order to escape from Opar? There must be some other way. There is no other way, Tarzan of the Apes, she replied. The avenues across the valley are guarded by Kaj's people. Our only chance of escape lies in this direction, and I have brought you along the only trail that pierces the precipitous cliffs that guard Opar upon the south. Across or around this valley, we must go in an attempt to find an avenue across the mountain and down upon the other side. The ape-man stood gazing down into the wooded basin below them, his mind occupied with the problems of the moment. Had he been alone, he would not have come this way, for he was sufficiently confident of his own prowess to believe that he might easily have crossed the valley of Opar in comparative safety, regardless of Kaj's plans to the contrary. But he was not alone. He had now to think of La, and he realized that in her efforts to save him, she had placed him under a moral obligation which he might not disregard. To skirt the basin, keeping as far as possible from the building, which he could see in the distance, seemed the wisest course to pursue, since, of course, his sole purpose was to find a way across the mountain and out of this inhospitable country. But the glimpses he caught of the edifice, half concealed as it was amid the foliage of great trees, piqued his curiosity to such an extent that he felt an almost irresistible urge to investigate. He did not believe that the basin was inhabited by other than wild beasts, and he attributed the building which he saw to the handiwork of an extinct or departed people, either contemporaneous with the ancient Atlanteans who had built Opar, or perhaps built by the original Oparians themselves, but now forgotten by their descendants. The glimpses which he caught of the building suggested such size and magnificence as might belong to a palace. The ape-man knew no fear, though he possessed, to a reasonable extent, that caution which is inherent in all wild beasts. He would not have hesitated to pit his cunning and his prowess against the lower orders, however ferocious they might be, for, unlike man, they could not band together to his undoing. But should men elect to hunt him in numbers, he knew that a real danger would confront him, and that in the face of their combined strength and intelligence, his own might not avail him. There was little likelihood, however, he reasoned, that the basin was inhabited by human beings. Doubtless closer investigation of the building he saw would reveal that it was but a deserted ruin, and that the most formidable foes he would encounter would be the great apes and the lions. Of neither of these had he any fear. With the former, it was even reasonable to imagine that he might establish amicable relations. Believing as he did that he must look for egress from the basin upon its opposite side, it was only natural that he should wish to choose the most direct route across the basin. Therefore, his inclinations to explore the valley were seconded by considerations of speed and expediency. "Come," he said to Lair, and started down the declivity which led into the basin in the direction of the building ahead of them. "You are not going that way," she cried in astonishment. "Why not?" he said. "It is the shortest way across the valley, and in so far as I can judge, our trail over the mountains is more likely to lie in that direction than elsewhere." "But I am afraid," she said. "The flaming god alone knows what hideous dangers lurk in the depths of that forest below us." "Only Numa and the Mangani," he said. "Of these we need have no fear." "You fear nothing," she said, "but I am only a woman." "We can die but once," replied Tarzan, "and that once we must die. To be always fearing, then, would not avert it, and would make life miserable. We shall go the short way, then, and perhaps we shall see enough to make the risk well worth while." They followed a well-worn trail downward among the brush, the trees increasing in both size and number as they approached the floor of the basin, until at last they were walking beneath the foliage of a great forest. What wind there was at their back, and the ape-man, though he moved at a swinging walk, was constantly on the alert. Upon the hard-packed earth of the trail, there were few signs to indicate the nature of the animals that had passed to and fro, but here and there the spoor of a lion was in evidence. Several times Tarzan stopped and listened. Often he raised his head, and his sensitive nostrils dilated as he sought for whatever the surrounding air might hold for him. "I think there are men in this valley," he said presently. "For some time I have been almost positive that we are being watched. But whoever is stalking us is clever beyond words, for it is only the barest suggestion of another presence that I can scent." La looked about apprehensively and drew close to his side. "I see no one," she said, in a low voice. "Nor I," he replied. "Nor can I catch any well-defined scent spoor, yet I am positive that someone is following us. Someone or something that trails by scent, and is clever enough to keep its scent from us. It is more than likely that whatever it is passing through the trees at a sufficient height to keep its scent spoor always above us. The air is right for that, and even if he were upwind from us, we might not catch his scent at all. Wait here. I will make sure." And he swung lightly into the branches of a nearby tree and swarmed upward with the agility of Manu, the monkey. A moment later, he descended to the girl's side. "I was right," he said. "There is someone, or something not far off. But whether it is man or mangani I cannot say, for the odor is a strange one to me, suggesting neither, yet both. But two can play at that game. Come. And he swung the girl to his shoulder, and a moment later had carried her high into the trees. Unless he is close enough to watch us, which I doubt, he said, our spoor will be carried over his head, and it will be some time before he can pick it up again, unless he is wise enough to rise to a higher level. La marveled at the strength of the ape-man, as he carried her easily from tree to tree, and at the speed with which he traversed the swaying leafy trail. For half an hour he continued onward, and then quite suddenly he stopped, poised high upon a swaying bough. Look, he said, pointing ahead and below them. Looking in the direction that he indicated, the girl saw through the leafy foliage a small, heavily stockaded compound in which were some dozen huts that immediately riveted her surprised attention, nor no less was the ape-man's curiosity piqued by what he glimpsed vaguely through the foliage. Huts they evidently were, but they seemed to be moving to and fro in the air, some moving gently backward and forward, while others jumped up and down in more or less violent agitation. Tarzan swung to a nearer tree and descended to a sturdy branch, to which he lowered La from his shoulder. Then he crept forward stealthily, the girl following, for she was, in common with the other Oparians, slightly arboreal. Presently they reached a point where they could see plainly the village below them, and immediately the seeming mystery of the dancing huts was explained. They were of the beehive type, common to many African tribes, and were about 7 feet in diameter by 6 or 7 in height. But instead of resting on the ground, each hut was suspended by a heavy hawser-like grass rope to a branch of one of the several giant trees that grew within the stockade. From the center of the bottom of each hut trailed another lighter rope. From his position above them, Tarzan saw no openings in any of the huts large enough to admit the body of a man, though there were several openings, 4 or 5 inches in diameter, in the sides of each hut, about 3 feet above the floor. Upon the ground, inside the compound, were several of the inhabitants of the village, if the little collection of swinging houses could be dignified by such a name. Nor were the people any less strange to Tarzan than their peculiar domiciles. That they were Negroes was evident, but of a type entirely unfamiliar to the ape-man. All were naked and without any ornamentation whatsoever other than a few daubs of color, placed apparently at random upon their bodies. They were tall and very muscular appearing, though their legs seemed much too short and their arms too long for perfect symmetry, while their faces were almost bestial in contour, their jaws being exaggeratedly prognathous, while above their beetling brows there was no forehead, the skull running back in an almost horizontal plane to a point. As Tarzan stood looking at them, he saw another descend one of the ropes that dangled from the bottom of a hut, and immediately he understood the purpose of the ropes and the location of the entrances to the dwellings. The creatures squatting about upon their haunches were engaged in feeding. Several had bones from which they were tearing the uncooked flesh with their great teeth, while others ate fruit and tubers. There were individuals of both sexes and of various ages, from childhood to maturity, but there was none that seemed very old. They were practically hairless, except for scraggy reddish-brown locks upon their heads. They spoke but seldom, and then in tones which resembled the growling of beasts. Nor once, while Tarzan watched them, did he see one laugh or even smile, which, of all their traits, rendered them most unlike the average native of Africa. Though Tarzan's eyes searched the compound carefully, he saw no indication of cooking utensils or of any fire. Upon the ground about them lay their weapons, short javelin-like spears, and a sort of battle axe with a sharpened metal blade. Tarzan of the Apes was glad that he had come this way, for it had permitted him to see such a type of native as he had not dreamed existed, a type so low that it bordered closely upon the brute. Even the Wasdons and Hodons of Palaldon were far advanced in the scale of evolution compared to these. As he looked at them, he could not but wonder that they were sufficiently intelligent to manufacture the weapons they possessed, which he could see, even at a distance, were of fine workmanship and design. Their huts, too, seemed well and ingeniously made, while the stockade, which surrounded the little compound, was tall, strong, and well built, evidently for the purpose of safeguarding them against the lions which infested the basin. As Tarzan and La watched these people, they became presently aware of the approach of some creature from their left, and a moment later they saw a man similar to those of the compound swing from a tree that overhung the stockade and drop within. The others acknowledged his coming with scarce more than indifferent glances. He came forward, and squatting among them, appeared to be telling them of something, and though Tarzan could not hear his words, he judged from his gestures and the sign language which he used to supplement his meager speech that he was telling his fellows of the strange creatures he had seen in the forest a short time before, and the ape-man immediately judged that this was the same whom he had been aware was following them, and whom he had successfully put off the scent. The narration evidently excited them, for some of them arose, and leaping up and down with bent knees, slapped their arms against their sides grotesquely. The expressions upon their faces scarcely changed, however, and after a moment each squatted down again as he had been before. It was while they were thus engaged that there echoed through the forest a loud scream that awakened in the mind of the ape-man many savage memories. "Bolgani," he whispered to La. "It is one of the great apes," she said, and shuddered. Presently they saw him, swinging down the jungle trail toward the compound. A huge gorilla, but such a gorilla as Tarzan of the Apes had never looked on before. Of almost gigantic stature, the creature was walking erect, with the stride of a man, not ever once touching his knuckles to the ground. His head and face were almost those of a gorilla, and yet there was a difference, as Tarzan could note as the creature came nearer. It was Bolgani, with the soul and brain of a man. Nor was this all that rendered the creature startling and unique. Stranger perhaps than aught else was the fact that it wore ornaments, and such ornaments. Gold and diamonds sparkled against its shaggy coat. Above its elbows were numerous armlets, and there were anklets upon its legs, while from a girdle about its middle there depended before and behind a long narrow strip that almost touched the ground, and which seemed to be entirely constructed of golden spangles set with small diamonds. Never before had John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, seen such a display of barbaric finery, nor even amidst the jewels of Opar such a wealth of priceless stones. Immediately after the hideous scream had first broken the comparative silence of the forest, Tarzan had noticed its effects upon the inmates of the compound. Instantly, they had arisen to their feet. The women and children scurried behind the boles of the trees or clambered up the ropes into their swinging cages, while some of the men advanced to what Tarzan now saw was the gate of the compound. Outside this gate, the gorilla halted and again raised his voice, but this time in speech rather than his hideous scream. Chapter 9. The Shaft of Death. As the huge man-like gorilla entered the compound, the warriors closed the gate and fell back respectfully as he advanced to the center of the village, where he stood for a moment, looking about. "Where are the Shis and the Balus?" he asked tersely. "Call them." The women and the children must have heard the command, but they did not emerge from their hiding places. The warriors moved about uneasily, evidently torn by the conflicting emotions of fear of the creature who had issued the order and reluctance to fulfill his commands. "Call them," he repeated, "or go and fetch them." But at last, one of the warriors mustered the courage to address him. "This village has already furnished one woman within the moon," he said. "It is the turn of another village." "Silence!" roared the gorilla man, advancing threateningly toward him. "You are a rash Gomangani to threaten the will of a Bolgani. I speak with the voice of Numa, the emperor. Obey or die." Trembling, the black turned and called the women and children, but none responded to his summons. The Bolgani gestured impatiently. "Go and fetch them," he demanded, and the blacks, cringing, moved sullenly across the compound toward the hiding places of their women and children. Presently they returned, dragging them with them, by the arms sometimes, but usually by the hair. Although they had seemed loath to give them up, they showed no gentleness toward them, nor any indication of affection. Their attitude toward them, however, was presently explained to Tarzan by the next words of the warrior who had spoken previously. "Great Bolgani," he said, addressing the gorilla man, "if Numa takes always from this village, there will soon be not enough women for the warriors here, and there will be too few children, and in a little time there will be none of us left." "What of that?" growled the gorilla man. "There are already too many Gomangani in the world. For what other purpose were you created than to serve Numa, the emperor, and his chosen people, the Bolgani?" As he spoke, he was examining the women and children, pinching their flesh and pounding upon their chests and backs. Presently, he returned to a comparatively young woman, straddling whose hip was a small child. "This one will do," he said, snatching the child from its mother and hurling it roughly across the compound, where it lay against the face of the palisade, moaning pitifully, and perchance broken and dying. The poor, stupid mother, apparently more beast than human, stood for a moment, trembling in dumb anguish, and then she started to rush forward to her child. But the gorilla man seized her with one of his great hands and hurled her to the ground. Simultaneously, there arose from the silent foliage above them the fierce and terrible scream of the challenging bull-ape. In terror, the simple blacks cast affrighted glances upward, while the gorilla man raised his hideous face in snarling anger toward the author of the bestial cry. Swaying upon a leafy bough, they beheld such a creature as none of them had ever looked upon before. A white man, a Tarmangani, with hide as hairless as the body of Histar, the snake. In the instant that they looked, they saw the spear hand of the stranger drive forward, and the shaft, speeding with the swiftness of thought, bury itself in the breast of the Bolgani. With a single scream of rage and pain, the gorilla man crumbled to the earth, where he struggled spasmodically for a moment, and then lay still, in death. The ape-man held no great love for the Gomangani as a race, but inherent in his English brain and heart was the spirit of fair play, which prompted him to spontaneous espousal of the cause of the weak. On the other hand, Bolgani was his hereditary enemy. His first battle had been with Bolgani, and his first kill. The poor blacks were still standing in stupefied wonderment when he dropped from the tree to the ground among them. They stepped back in terror, and simultaneously they raised their spears menacingly against him. "I am a friend," he said. "I am Tarzan of the apes. Lower your spears." And then he turned and withdrew his own weapon from the carcass of Bolgani. "Who is this creature that may come into your village and slay your balus and steal your sheaves. Who is he that you dare not drive your spears through him?" "He is one of the great Bolgani," said the warrior, who seemed to be spokesman and the leader in the village. "He is one of the chosen people of Numa, the emperor, and when Numa learns that he has been killed in our village, we shall all die for what you have done." "Who is Numa?" demanded the ape-man, to whom Numa, in the language of the great apes, meant only lion. "Numa is the emperor," replied the black, "who lives with the Bolgani in the Palace of Diamonds." He did not express himself in just these words, for the meager language of the great apes, even though amplified by the higher intelligence and greater development of the Oparians, is still primitive in the extreme. What he had really said was more nearly Numa, the king of kings, who lives in the king's hut of glittering stones, which carried to the ape-man's mind the faithful impression of the fact. Numa, evidently, was the name adopted by the king of the Bolgani, and the title emperor indicated merely his preeminence among the chiefs. The instant that Bolgani had fallen, the bereaved mother rushed forward and gathered her injured infant into her arms. She squatted now against the palisade, cuddling it to her breast and crooning softly to pacify its cries, which Tarzan suddenly discovered were more the result of fright than injury. At first, the mother had been frightened when he had attempted to examine the child, drawing away and baring her fighting fangs, much after the manner of a wild beast. But presently there had seemed to come to her dull brain a realization that this creature had saved her from Bolgani, that he had permitted her to recover her infant, and that he was making no effort to harm either of them. Convinced at last that the child was only bruised, Tarzan turned again toward the warriors, who were talking together in an excited little group a few paces away. As they saw him advancing, they spread into a semicircle and stood facing him. "The Bolgani will send and slay us all," they said, "when they learn what has happened in our village, unless we can take to them the creature that cast the spear. Therefore, Tarmangani, you shall go with us to the Palace of Diamonds, and there we shall give you over to the Bolgani, and perhaps Numa will forgive us." The ape-man smiled. What kind of creature did the simple blacks think him, to believe that he would permit himself to be easily led into the avenging hands of Numa, the emperor of the Bolgani? Although he was fully aware of the risk that he had taken in entering the village, he knew too that because he was Tarzan of the apes, there was a greater chance that he would be able to escape than that they could hold him. He had faced savage spearmen before and knew precisely what to expect in the event of hostilities. He preferred, however, to make peace with these people, for it had been in his mind to find some means of questioning them the moment that he had discovered their village hidden away in this wild forest. "Wait," he said therefore, "would you betray a friend who enters your village to protect you from an enemy? We will not slay you, Tarmangani. We will take you to the Bolgani for Numa, the emperor." "But that would amount to the same thing," returned Tarzan, "for you well know that Numa, the emperor, will have me slain." "That we cannot help," replied the spokesman. "If we could save you, we would. But when the Bolgani discover what has happened in our village, it is we who must suffer, unless perhaps they are satisfied to punish you instead." "But why need they know that the Bolgani has been slain in your village?" asked Tarzan. "Will they not see his body next time they come?" asked the spokesman. "Not if you remove his body," replied Tarzan. The blacks scratched their heads. Into their dull, ignorant minds had crept no such suggestion of a solution of their problem. What the stranger said was true. None but they and he knew that Bolgani had been slain within their palisade. To remove the body, then, would be to remove all suspicion from their village. But where were they to take it? They put the question to Tarzan. "I will dispose of him for you," replied the Tarmangani. "Answer my questions truthfully, and I will promise to take him away and dispose of him in such a manner that no one will know how he died or where." "What are your questions?" asked the spokesman. "I am a stranger in your country. I am lost here," replied the ape-man, "and I would find a way out of the valley in that direction." And he pointed toward the southeast. The black shook his head. "There may be a way out of the valley in that direction," he said, "but what lies beyond no man knows, nor do I know whether there be a way out or whether there be anything beyond. It is said that all is fire beyond the mountain, and no one dares to go and see. As for myself, I have never been far from my village, at most only a day's march, to hunt for game for the Bolgani and to gather fruit and nuts and plantains for them. If there is a way out, I do not know, nor would any man dare take it if there were." "Does no one ever leave the valley?" asked Tarzan. "I know not what others do," replied the spokesman, "but those of this village never leave the valley." "What lies in that direction?" asked Tarzan, pointing toward Opar. "I do not know," replied the black, "only that sometimes the Bolgani come from that way, bringing with them strange creatures, little men with white skins and much hair, with short, crooked legs and long arms, and sometimes white shes, who do not look at all like the strange little Tarmangani. But where they get them, I do not know, nor do they ever tell us. Are these all the questions that you wish to ask?" "Yes, that is all," replied Tarzan, seeing that he could gain no information whatsoever from these ignorant villagers. Realizing that he must find his own way out of the valley, and knowing that he could do so much more quickly and safely if he was alone, he decided to sound the blacks in relation to a plan that had entered his mind. "If I take the Bolgani away so that the others will not know that he was slain in your village, will you treat me as a friend?" he asked. "Yes," replied the spokesman. "Then," said Tarzan, "will you keep here for me my white she until I return again to your village? You can hide her in one of your huts if a Bolgani comes, and no one need ever know that she is among you. What do you say?" The blacks looked around. "We do not see her," said the spokesman. "Where is she?" "If you will promise to protect her and hide her, I will bring her here," replied the ape-man. "I will not harm her," said the headman, "but I do not know about the others." Tarzan turned toward the others who were clustered about, listening. "I am going to bring my mate into your village," he said, "and you are going to hide her and feed her and protect her until I return. I shall take away the body of Bolgani, so that no suspicion shall fall upon you, and when I come back, I shall expect to find my mate safe and unharmed." He had thought it best to describe La as his mate, since thus they might understand that she was under his protection, and if they felt either gratitude or fear toward him, La would be safer. Raising his face toward the tree where she was hidden, he called to La to descend, and a moment later she clambered down to the lower branches of one of the trees in the compound and dropped into Tarzan's arms. "This is she," he said to the assembled blacks. "Guard her well and hide her from the Bolgani. If, upon my return, I find that any harm has befallen her, I shall take word to the Bolgani that it was you who did this," and he pointed to the corpse of the gorilla man. La turned appealingly toward him, fear showing in her eyes. "You are not going to leave me here?" she asked. "Temporarily only," replied Tarzan. "These poor people are afraid that if the death of this creature is traced to their village, they shall all suffer the wrath of his fellows, and so I have promised that I will remove the evidence in such a way as to direct suspicion elsewhere. If they are sufficiently high in the scale of evolution to harbor sentiments of gratitude, which I doubt, they will feel obligated to me for having slain this beast, as well as for preventing suspicion falling upon them. For these reasons, they should protect you. But to make assurance doubly sure, I have appealed also to their fear of the Bolgani, a characteristic which I know they possess. I am sure that you will be as safe here as with me until I return. Otherwise, I would not leave you. But alone, I can travel much faster. And while I am gone, I intend to find a way out of this valley. Then I shall return for you, and together we may make our escape easily, or at least with greater assurance of success than were we to blunder slowly about together. You will come back? She asked, a note of fear, longing and appeal in her voice. I will come back, he replied, and then turning to the blacks. Clear out one of these huts for my mate, and see that she is not molested and that she is furnished with food and water. And remember what I said, upon her safety your lives depend. Stooping, Tarzan lifted the dead gorilla man to his shoulder, and the simple blacks marveled at his prowess. Of great physical strength themselves, there was not one of them but would have staggered under the weight of Bolgani, yet this strange Tarmangani walked easily beneath his burden. And when they had opened the gate in the palisade, he trotted down the jungle trail as though he carried nothing but his own frame. A moment later, he disappeared at a turn and was swallowed by the forest. La turned to the blacks. Prepare my hut, she said, for she was very tired and longed to rest. They eyed her askance and whispered among themselves. It was evident to her that there was a difference of opinion among them. And presently, from snatches of conversation which she overheard, she realized that while some of the blacks were in favor of obeying Tarzan's injunctions implicitly, there were others who objected strenuously and who wished to rid their village of her, lest she be discovered there by the Bolgani and the villagers be punished accordingly. It would be better, she heard one of the blacks say, to turn her over to the Bolgani at once and tell them that we saw her mate slay the messenger of Numa. We will say that we tried to capture the Tarmangani, but that he escaped, and that we were only able to seize his mate. Thus will we win the favor of Numa, and perhaps then he will not take so many of our women and children. But the Tarmangani is great, replied one of the others. He is more powerful even than Bolgani. He would make a terrible enemy, and as the chances are that the Bolgani would not believe us, we should then have not only them, but the Tarmangani to fear. You are right, cried La. The Tarmangani is great. Far better will it be for you to have him for friend than enemy. Single-handed he grapples with Numa, the lion, and slays him. You saw with what ease he lifted the body of the mighty Bolgani to his shoulder. You saw him trot lightly down the jungle trail beneath his burden. With equal ease will he carry the corpse through the trees of the forest, far above the ground. In all the world, there is no other like him, no other like Tarzan of the apes. If you are wise, Gomangani, you will have Tarzan for a friend. The blacks listened to her, their dull faces revealing nothing of what was passing in their stupid brains. For a few moments, they stood thus in silence, the hulking, ignorant blacks upon one side, the slender, beautiful white woman upon the other. Then La spoke. Go, she cried imperiously, and prepare my hut. It was the high priestess of the flaming god, La, the queen of Opar, addressing slaves. Her regal mien, her commanding tones, wrought an instant change in the villagers, and La knew then that Tarzan was right in his assumption that they could be moved only through fear. For now they turned quickly, cowering like whipped dogs, and hastened to a nearby hut, which they quickly prepared for her, fetching fresh leaves and grasses for its floor, and fruit and nuts and plantains for her meal. When all was ready, La clambered up the rope and through the circular opening in the floor of the hanging hut, which she found large and airy and now reasonably clean. She drew the rope up after her and threw herself upon the soft bed they had prepared for her, and soon the gentle swaying of the swinging hut, the soft murmur of the leaves above her, the voices of the birds and insects combined with her own physical exhaustion to lull her into deep slumber.